Chapter 1361. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 22 seconds p.m. Chapter 1361. Archetypes. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1361 Archetypes. Aina couldn't have been more right. In fact, she was so right that Lionel almost regretted not having asked this question earlier. All of his tendencies, she had gotten down to an exact science. Lionel rarely, if ever, went all out in battle. Sometimes it wasn't even as Aina said and that he just felt there was a more efficient way to win. Sometimes it was just because he liked having trump cards in his back pocket to prepare a perfect counter-attack given the situation. The style of battle Lionel liked to use was one that withheld as many cards as possible until it was the most advantageous moment to use them. There was even a very long time in his life where he didn't even use his speed branch of his snowy star owl lineage factor because it was so much more beneficial to have his enemies believe him to be a slow, bumbling spearman. And this was just one example. Lionel could think of countless others Aina hadn't mentioned, like his wisdom branch, his gravity domain. Sometimes he even neglected to use his radiant force despite the fact fire elemental force was quite literally one of his most powerful weapons. Then there was the most glaring one, his bow force. It was fine if Lionel saved his bow force as a trump card back when he could only use it 2 or 3 times in battle before collapsing. But now that he had a quasi-life grade bow, he quite literally didn't have this problem at all. It had been entirely negated. Yet, Lionel was content to keep this card in back pocket, waiting for the moment he had to use it. But, all of this was fine until Lionel considered the words Aina hadn't spoken. A true warrior brought out their greatest strength and forced their enemies to meet them on their terms. They didn't care about the retaliation of their enemy because they were already confident that their greatest strength would trump everything. Compared to this ideal, Lionel was sorely lacking. In fact, his battle style could even be said to be directly opposing to Valiant. In some way, he had been aware of this. That was why during his battle with Miguel, he had chosen not to use his ability index at all. Lionel was far too confident in his ability to win with his mind. Even the likes of Miguel would only be a matter of an added bit of effort. If Lionel was honest, though, let alone a valiant warrior, his method of battle definitely didn't feel like the way of a king either, and that was just the honest truth. Lionel fell into his thoughts, not quite sure of what direction to go in. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. He didn't want to become a brute who only thought of honor in battle. That wasn't him, even though he liked to dabble in it from time to time. He would never act that way during a battle that really meant something. At best, he had seen Miguel as a bit of fun, but he felt that Aina's words had great merit as well. What use was his training if he threw it all out the window the instant he entered a battle? It was no wonder why he could never settle on a style. He was constantly going his own way and making up his own path. Style. Lionel's gaze suddenly flashed. Create new ability subcategory. Call it Dream Class. Set parameters. Archer. Spearman. Fighter. Mage. Set subparameters. Sniper Archer. Explosive Archer. Strong Spearman. Flexible Spearman. Mixed Fighter. Speed Fighter. Fire Mage. Defensive Mage. Combat Mage. Lionel's mind went into overdrive, formulating a new ability, splitting it into 4 sub-categories and then further into 9 sub-categories. Dream Class was an application of Lionel's Tier 4 control. Lionel saw this situation just like he had his spear dilemma. He could never decide whether to focus on instinct or calculation, until the day it all snapped into place and he felt he could subtly grasp the intricacies of both. This would be no different. Lionel had 4 main archetypes: Archer, Spearman, Fighter, and Mage. Depending on the situation, he tended to rely on one or the other, sometimes mixing and matching. This time, however, he would do so far more deliberately. By shifting these 4 archetypes into a Tier 4 ability, he was essentially honing all the skill his body had in a certain path and fine-tuning it to maximize his strength in this category. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. For example, if Lionel ran into an opponent he thought would best be dealt with as an archer, the first thing he would ask himself is if he should be a sniper archer or explosive archer. The sniper archer archetype focused on long-ranged, unmoving assault. It was a relentless pinning of an enemy from a distance. Explosive archer involved movement. The power output was less than that of the sniper archer, but its flexibility benefited from it. Once Lionel made the decision of which to go with, he would activate Dream Class. Once Dream Class was in effect, everything about Lionel's very being would shift to optimize this archetype. If he chose Explosive Archer, he would hone in on light elemental force, movement technique conducive to evasion and firing at the same time would be prioritized, and he would focus on rapid fire rather than powerful shots. If he chose Sniper Archer, his element of choice would lean more toward fire. He would root himself in place, focusing on heaviness and power. Every strike would be aimed toward maximizing strength and quality of shot. Organize all techniques and abilities, categorize into archetypes, deduce strength. Lionel began to organize everything he knew one by one. Some abilities fit into multiple archetypes, but he didn't mind duplicating them as he saw fit. Soon, he had finished tabulating the result and had come to a conclusion. Sniper Archer, 0. 58 Explosive Archer, 0. 31 Strong Spearman, 0. 13 Flexible Spearman, 0. 11 Mixed Fighter, 0. 07 Speed Fighter, 0. 07 Fire Mage, 0. 18 Defensive Mage, 0. 11 Combat Mage, 0. 10. Lionel realized that of all the archetypes he could fit into, only Sniper Archer was even close to meeting his maximum output while relying on his ability index. All of the rest were severely lacking. Chapter 1362. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 21 seconds p.m. Chapter 1362. Efficiency. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1362 Efficiency. Though Lionel had subconsciously always known, seeing the numbers laid out before him now was depressing. It only put into perspective just how right Ana was. The numbers were fairly straightforward. 100 was a theoretical maximum that Lionel could reach. This maximum was decided by the maximum strength Lionel could match by using his mind. This theoretical limit thus became his ceiling. It was difficult for Lionel to put a real tier or dimension on this max strength of his because the numbers were all so variable. No two tier 9s were the same, and depending on talent, ability index, lineage factors, and a host of other variables, the strength of two individuals could be wildly different. This was why Lionel could use tricks in his mind to defeat six-dimensional existences of lesser galaxies, while here, it hadn't been rare for him to run into fifth-dimensional existence he had to put in quite some effort to defeat. Even now, Lionel didn't believe that he had met the theoretically strongest existence within the fifth dimension yet. That Tier 9 ruined Raypax he had just defeated was only of a particular grade, and according to Y's star order, there were definitely far more powerful ruined Raypax. This was all to say that assigning a value of 100 to his adjusted strength output was the best that Lionel could do. This was the value that took in a combination of everything he could do, his mind, his thinking speed, his quick reaction times and deduction abilities, and put them together to formulate a certain ceiling of strength. When things were looked at this way, the numbers became far more depressing. Sniper Archer was the best, but even that could only bring out 58% of Lionel's true strength. A step down from that was Explosive Archer, but it plummeted 27 points down to 31%. The rest were even worse. Lionel almost couldn't help but chuckle. It's not accurate to say that this is 58% of my true strength, but it's more like a measurement of efficiency. The closer I am to 100%, the more exponential the increase in my output, with a massive watershed occurring probably at least once per 20 points. That means I'm a lot further away than just 42% away. And that's just with one. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Sniper Archer being the strongest wasn't a surprise to Lionel. Bar none, Lionel's strongest strength currently was his bow force. So long as he could be rooted to a singular spot and shoot to his heart's content, his power output would be devastating. However, the rest was far worse. Fire Mage was a bit of a surprise at 0.18, but this was likely due to Lionel comprehending the first rune of his Scarlet Star Force. Just that comprehension alone had closed the gap between his Bow Force and his lesser dimensional Fire Force by a great measure. What if? Calculate. Scarlet Mage. Scarlet Mage, 3.19. Seeing this number, Lionel sighed. It seems that even his mind couldn't make up the gap of his inability to use Scarlet Star Force freely. 319% was a value that he found difficult to compute, especially since the scale he was using was exponential. If he ignored everything and was content to end his life here and now, it might not be impossible for him to kill even a quasi-seventh dimensional existence. After finishing these calculations, Lionel explained them all to Aina. After she looked at him a bit weirdly for a moment, she opened her mouth to speak, only to be stopped by Lionel's chuckle. What is it? Do you always break down your abilities with such raw numbers? I used to do it a lot more frequently, but the system was flawed when I used it on others because there were too many variables to account for. It's 100% accurate when I use it on myself, though. It's just that there's no real point in doing so. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Well, honestly, I'm not sure how these numbers would translate in the future. If you increased the efficiency of each individual class, what would happen to your overall strength? How would you calculate it if the goalposts kept moving? Instead of moving the goalposts, I could just put a stake down as a checkpoint. That way, there will be a version 1 of 1.0.0 and a version 2. Sure, you could do that, but then what would be the point? If your individual classes would also be behind whatever version 2, 3, or 4 there was, then it just goes back to the idea that you should be focused on your mind anyway. Maybe. Unless I have a different sort of end goal. Aina's brow raised, waiting for Lionel to continue. Technically, given a number of factors, I could probably make a lot more than just 9 classes. If I mix and match, I could make classes like Spearman Mage or Fire Archer, or any other number of things. The reason why I chose these exact 9, though, was because they are the most foundational. Everything else grows outward from them. However, it's because it's all so disjointed that I'm probably having such issues to begin with, right? But, if I can increase the efficiency of each one, then my ability to tell exactly what should be used in battle skyrockets as well. I tend to use as little as possible in battle, in one part to keep trump cards, but another reason is because it's easier to perform high-level calculations when the variables are minimized. Oddly enough, the reason why Sniper Archer is probably highest isn't only due to my bow force, but it's also by far the simplest of all the classes. If I can raise the efficiency of each class to 60, 70, maybe even 90%, or a theoretical 100% in the future, then how well I can shift from one style in battle to another also increases. Then, the day that I can use them all seamlessly and form a unique style of my own will be in reach. Lionel smiled. This was what he wanted. A fusion of instinctual combat given by individual classes and his mind's calculative abilities. The results would definitely be beyond imagination. We're out of this hive. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1363. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 22 p.m. Chapter 1363, Escape or Gamble? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1363 Escape or Gamble? Lionel came to a pause, his gaze sharpening. His makeshift spear was gripped in his hands and his senses were primed. Their journey through this hive had been too smooth. Remembering back to the map Little Blackstar had gotten them, there was only one more hive to go through before they could escape this part of the void battlefield. But, it was all too convenient. Little Blackstar had managed to move fast enough to avoid the initial lock of senses that could have gone poorly for them. However, he had still ended up being detected by the Shadow Sovereign Rapax. Knowing this, the fact that they had only been hounded by a single Tier 9 ruined Rapax was too odd. Then there was something else to consider. From Little Blackstar's memory, the shadow domain of the Shadow Sovereign Rapax had been far smaller than it should have been while deployed. In fact, it was only 2 or 3 meters in diameter, a size when compared to the scope of this network of nests was like a needle drifting through the ocean. If it wasn't because Little Blackstar was trying to blanket everything, it would have never been a problem. One might not understand why this was so odd. Given the fact that maintaining a shadow domain was so taxing on the user, wouldn't it make sense to keep it as small as possible to begin with? Since the shadow domain followed its deployer as its epicenter, it was much more convenient to maintain a small shadow domain, especially for a hand-to-hand combat race like the Rapax. So long as they were fighting an enemy, 3 meters was more than enough to keep their target within frame. Lionel had, of course, thought of this as well. But, he still felt that something was off. For one, a shadow domain wasn't under constant deployment. It required active thought and action to use. That meant, if one was focused on maintaining your stamina, you wouldn't deploy it at all. Secondly, if under normal conditions you wouldn't deploy a shadow domain, that would mean that there were very few instances where you would. One such instance was for the purpose of what Little Blackstar had tried to do by helping Lionel and Aina. However, another one should be battle. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The issue was neither of these reasons made sense. Why would a Rapax be fighting in their own nest? Of course, this was an odd thing to say considering they had been invaded by the likes of Lionel and the others, but the problem here was that a Rapax of such status wouldn't personally help deal with what amounted to small fry in their eyes. Something about this just feels off. This sort of trial is too dangerous to begin with. Thrusting us all into enemy territory like this without an easy way to come back just makes no sense. This feels like a stealth mission, but Void Palace isn't a place that grooms assassins. There might be 1 or 2 factions within that cater to that demographic, but definitely not enough to throw an entire generation under the bus like this. I would understand if we were just thrown onto the battlefield itself and it was just a matter of survival. But a Rapax nest? That's more than a little excessive. Plus, from Mom's story about her relationship with Dad, she wasn't even allowed to step onto the Void battlefield until she became a Galaxy-ranked disciple. And even then, she had Dad as a supervisor to protect her. Did things really change this much? Is there new management? Is it possible that I'm being targeted? Or is it because this generation is more talented than others? But if it's because we're more talented, even if you up the difficulty by a margin, was it necessary to react to this good news by throwing us into a fiery pit of hell? Lionel didn't even know what to think. Still, everything seemed to point toward this matter being a special event of sorts. If he was correct, then the odd coincidence of the Rapax he had met until this point being so manageable might not be such a coincidence at all. Lionel explained his thoughts to Aina. So you think that the Rapax are occupied by something, which would explain the oddity of the shadow domain that hurt Blackstar? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. I think so. It would both explain why this Shadow Sovereign hasn't come after us yet and why we've only run into manageable enemies. In fact, the only 6-dimensional Rapax we ran into was due to the fact I forced us to teleport together. If we had teleported individually like was intended, I have a feeling that we wouldn't have had to deal with even that. If it really is a special event like you said, then there's 2 possibilities. The first is that we're supposed to take advantage of this lull in security to escape as fast as possible. Or we're supposed to go to the center of the nest to begin with. Lionel finished. In truth, Lionel should have thought of this long ago, however, his life experiences had skewed his bias too far. Someone who innately trusted organizations might have already thought that there was no way the Void Palace would send their students to their death. As such, they would conclude that this couldn't possibly be an impossible task and that there was either a hidden challenge here or the Void Palace had made it easier to escape. Lionel, however, who always seemed to have terrible luck with organizations, only really trusted himself. As such, he had little to no expectations of others helping him to remain safe at all. As such, in an irony of all ironies, Lionel, who had one of the sharpest minds of this generation, was actually one of the last to figure out something so simple. "What do you want to do?" Lionel asked. "Escape or gamble?" Aina smiled. "Let's have fun." As expected, Lionel was correct. The greatest geniuses of this generation, a group that would have been amethyst in almost any over-selection year, had already begun to converge upon the central nest. Chapter 1364. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 18 seconds p.m. Chapter 1364. Stumbled. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. After stabilizing Little Blackstar and placing him within the segmented cube, Aina and Lionel broke out into a dead sprint. No longer worried about being found out and being more confident in the sort of trial they were currently taking part in, they took smaller measures toward protecting themselves in such a fashion. However, even as they ran, Lionel didn't forget to check all his bases. This sort of thing. It was still leaving an odd taste in his mouth. This matter seemed to require precise timing, but it had to be remembered that Lionel's actions had stalled the true selection for several months. Of course, it was possible that this event could take place over a long period of time, which was why the elders of the Void Palace would feel confident in allowing this to happen in the first place, but there was no way for Lionel to tell immediately. Luckily, he had a trusty encyclopedia of sorts. "Old man, what do you think about this?" Lionel reached out to Wise Star Order. But, surprisingly, he didn't get an answer. He tried again, but was once more met with more silence. After a while, Lionel chuckled. "You don't need to be scared, old man, my dad isn't here anymore. You can stop hiding. Not that it would do you much good to begin with." A light cough resounded in Lionel's ears. It seemed filled with a hint of embarrassment and another part righteous indignation, as though he was offended by the accusation. Unfortunately, there was no hiding it. When Velasco had appeared, Wise Star Order thought his life was forfeit. Though Lionel had vouched for this odd relationship of theirs, when a father wanted to act, what could a son do? This was especially so with Velasco, considering anything Wise Star Order did in front of that man felt all too easy for the former to see right through. Luckily, he had left without doing much more than glancing in his general direction. However, Wise Star Order was still suffering from cold sweats. "Just tell me, is there any ritual the Rapax might undergo, maybe something that is predictable, that would also last for a very long time? It should also be something that others might be able to benefit from, because I don't see why the Void Palace would allow this unless there were benefits to be gotten. Oh, and these benefits probably shouldn't be enough to move seventh-dimensional existences. Or, at the very least, they should be useless to seventh-dimensional existences, or else it wouldn't make sense for them to leave this opportunity to us rather than taking advantage themselves." This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Lionel gave Wise Star Order a list of requirements, hoping the old man would be able to think of something. He would assume that a race like the Rapax might have many rituals and customs that could fall into such a category, but hopefully only a few that might be related to a nest while also fitting these requirements. However, the answer he received from Wise Star Order was outside of his expectations. No. There shouldn't be any ritual of the like. The Rapax aren't a race that participates in such things. They have a very strict hierarchy, they live for war, and duty is at the forefront of their minds. They're very big on cycles of life and giving, not to mention oneness of mind and purpose. It wouldn't be like them to divert their attention toward any sort of ceremony. Lionel's brow furrowed. If there was no ritual, then what could possibly be happening? Then what about something that would require a large amount of precise control? There's a shadow sovereign Rapax here whose shadow domain was shrunk to a suspiciously small area. The only reason I can think of that such a thing would be necessary is if they needed extremely fine control over a given area, but that much is far too broad. A shadow domain allowed a shadow sovereign to bend reality to their whims within certain limits, of course depending on dimensional level. The larger the domain, the more stamina it took. So, Lionel assumed that if the shadow domain had been shrunk, and it was unlike the shadow sovereign was in a heated battle, then it must be trying to control something or the environment around something. The Rapax birthed a shadow sovereign? The shout reverberated through Lionel's mind, almost causing his feet to stumble. Aina quickly reached out a hand, stabilizing his shoulder with a worried expression on her face. Her first instinct was to think that what had happened before still had lingering effects on Lionel. What the hell, old man? In his shock, Wise Star Order had done the equivalent of violently shaking Lionel's soul. That felt no different from poking and prodding at an open wound. This wasn't because Lionel's soul was injured, but rather because it was like tender flesh in its current state. It was incredibly sensitive to outside pressures. Shut up, brat, you have no idea what this means. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net obviously not. That's why I'm asking you. I told you before that the Rapax don't really have any culture or rituals, this much is true. But, they do have certain legends that they abide by. The birth of a shadow sovereign is akin to the birth of a king for the Rapax. A ruined Rapax with the abilities of a shadow sovereign is like a real dragon. Upon reaching maturity, such an existence would be practically untouchable. Why do you keep saying birth? Because it hasn't been born yet, idiot. It's definitely still within its egg. How the hell do you know that? Common sense. You keep thinking that the domain is too small when in reality it never shrunk to begin with, that's just its original size. That's impossible. Little Blackstar wouldn't lose to a newborn. It's not just a newborn, fool. Like I told you before, the Rapax have a tradition of using fertilizer for their newborn. But, when a talent on this level is in the process of being nurtured, they go several steps further. Even living Rapax pour all of their strength into it. This baby, under the Rapax care and nurturing, would be born at Tier 9 of the 5th dimension instantly. Wait. Lionel suddenly thought of a possibility. That's right. All the Rapax here, especially those of the highest levels, are currently severely weakened because they've given everything to this newborn. That's likely why the Void Palace saw fit to send you all in. But that isn't enough of a reason for you to have screamed in my ears like that. Of course it is. Rapax are the only humanoid species born from eggs. In that state, they're not only very vulnerable, but they're basically just like enormous beast crystals. Except unlike beast crystals, swallowing the essence of a Rapax egg that has been prepared in this fashion comes with its own supporting vitality. What I'm trying to say is that regardless of your ability index, if you swallow the essence of a Rapax egg that's had so much vitality and life force poured into it, you gain its ability without any side effects or impact to your own ability index. Lionel almost stumbled and fell again. This time, it had nothing to do with Wise Star Order yelling in his ear. Chapter 1365. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 1365. There was a reason if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again 1365. There was a reason Lionel was stunned, not knowing how to take this news. Even the silver tablet couldn't do this. When the silver tablet erased the personality of a previously held ability, it could be absorbed. But, one still had to be very careful about doing so. This was because when absorbed, both abilities would combine and an average of the two would be taken. This meant that if you absorbed an ability completely incompatible with yourself, you would essentially be crippling both abilities, and by proxy, yourself. However, according to Wise Star Order, absorbing the essence of this egg would be like gaining a second ability without the side effects. The weird thing about this though was, why was it that the elders of Void Palace didn't want this? Why would anyone be opposed to something that essentially broke the fundamental rules of the dimensional verse? Why? Lionel asked. Are they really so kind-hearted to leave this to us? Kind-hearted? Wise Star Order snorted. The Rapax aren't fools. Do you think they would leave themselves in such a vulnerable position just because? This entire hive is blocked off from existences above the 6th dimension. In fact, it's not just this, but even higher level 6th-dimensional existences have been completely blocked off. You lot are about the only ones that can enter in the first place. Secondly, did you not hear what I said about vitality? It's the copious amounts of vitality within the Rapak's egg that tricks the regulator into believing there are two people, not one. This, as a result, allows the birth of two ability indexes within the same person. However, this vitality must be above or, at the very least, near your own. Like I said, the baby Rapaks will be born at Tier 9 of the 5th dimension using this ritual. That means you can't be much stronger than this, or else your vitality will be too great. If your vitality is too high, the regulator won't sense two lives, it will only sense yours. Once that happens, your two abilities will fuse instead of remaining separate. That means that it's impossible for anyone that's too high tiered to absorb this egg at all. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. When it all settled in, Lionel let out a breath. So things were like this. The elders of the Void Palace couldn't absorb this boon even if they wanted to. Aina, Lionel quickly explained everything Wise Star Order had explained to him. After taking it all in, she seemed to sigh a breath. So that's where that feeling was coming from. When they had first landed here, Aina had said that there was something incredibly nutritious nearby. She had assumed, along with Lionel, that this came from the eggs and the fertilizer used to upkeep them. And she was most definitely correct. It was just that she couldn't have imagined that things would actually be like this. This was more than just a little nutritious, it was absolutely game-changing. There were very few things in the dimensional verse that could break the balance of rule set. At the same time, though, this was odd. The Shadow Sovereign ability seemed perfect for Aina. But, if it was really so perfect, her ability index would have violently tugged her in that direction. Much like how she always knew the best meals to prepare for herself and the best training methods to use, she would also know when a great opportunity for improvement was nearby. If things had worked out as they should have, she would have figured out the use of this egg long before Lionel did and given him this information. Knowing this, Lionel would have drawn the appropriate conclusions long ago. This is perfect for you, Lionel said. Your battle style would fit seamlessly with this, I would think. It would also greatly boost your darkness affinity. No, I think it'll be best if you absorb it, Aina suddenly said. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel rose an eyebrow. It wasn't that Shadow Sovereign wouldn't be useful to him. Given his mind, technically speaking, any additional strength he gained made it less likely for anyone to defeat him. The more tools he had at his disposal, the more options he had to react in battle. However, Lionel wasn't too eager for this at the same time. And, there was no point for Little Blackstar to absorb the same ability index again. That left Aina as the best candidate. My body doesn't seem to want it, Aina said after a while. I'm not sure why, but the more I think about it, the stronger my revulsion toward it grows. This is the first time I've felt this way. Usually I feel either nothing or positive emotions. I've never felt a negative emotion before. I feel that it would cripple me. Lionel's gaze flashed. He couldn't quite understand why Aina would feel this way, he didn't have a proper understanding. But, regardless, he trusted her judgment for herself. It hadn't failed her before and he didn't see why it would start now. Plus, you spoke about your armor and your goals for it, right? A high darkness affinity is something you'll need if you want to find a way to counter your Scarlet Star Force with Void Star Force. Lionel fell into silence. Aina wasn't wrong, it was just that he had another solid method of raising his darkness elemental affinity to great heights. But, now that she mentioned it, this method just might be the easiest. Lionel didn't know much about these sovereigns, but he thought that it was about time he learned more. All right. He nodded. Rapaks. Aina's thighs suddenly grew a size as she stamped a foot down hard. She blasted by Lionel, her battle axe shimmering. By the time Lionel rounded the corner, the Rapaks in question had been split into two. However, it was what lay beyond that truly caught Lionel's attention. The good news? They had made it to the core of the network of nests like they wanted to. The bad news? Well, There was a reason they had run into so few Raypaks during their time here. Chapter 1366. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 1366. Muted if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1366 muted. Lionel took a breath, his grip on his spear tightening slightly. They were everywhere. Or, at the very least, it truly felt like it. The center of the nest was an enormous, perforated, ball of rock. Pathways of all shapes and sizes, winding in all sorts of different directions, jetted out from the perforations. This perforated ball of rock hovered above what looked like a green sea. This oddly discolored sea gave off a strong, pungent smell that seared one's nose hairs and tingled the skin. It looked like a vat of acid, and Lionel wasn't convinced that if he took a dip, that it would react any differently from one either. The number of Raypaks that moved through this construction weren't small. But there was something odd about their movements. Despite the fact Aina had just killed one of their own and they were in fairly clear view of them, none seemed to react. That was when something that should have been obvious all this time clicked for Lionel. The Raypaks are blind. Lionel had never noticed any eyes on the Raypaks. In fact, their pill-shaped heads were covered by their metallic carapaces, so he had just assumed that their eyes were underneath and they had a method of seeing through the metal casing. However, now Lionel realized that assumption had been stupid to make. He was still trying to see everything the Raypaks did through a human lens when they were decidedly not human at all. The Raypaks must have used a different method to track their prey, and since they had no reason to lock onto this particular location, they wouldn't react immediately. However, Lionel was no fool. He didn't believe that the Raypaks would be so inept. There was a large distance between the location he stood upon now and the perforated spherical rock that hung ahead. There was no pathway that connected it to where Lionel and Aina stood. If Lionel had to describe it, it was like they were standing in a window, looking through it. If they wanted in, they would have to find a doorway instead. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Lionel had a feeling, though, that if they truly did find a doorway, the reception wouldn't be nearly this benign. In fact, they would likely find themselves swarmed. Lionel fell into silence alongside Aina. The pair slowly backed away and retreated to the corner they had just wrapped around. Only then did they sigh a breath of relief and calmly access the situation again. They currently stood within a hallway, but there was a dead end on one side. It made Lionel a bit skeptical about how the Raypaks had engineered this place. It seemed that this window was actually a designed lookout. But it was obviously not a lookout for enemies, but rather a lookout for observing the work of the other Raypaks. If Lionel was correct, this confirmed one matter: the Raypaks did have methods of seeing things at long distances. And, secondly, it likely wouldn't be long before the Raypaks they had killed was noticed to be gone. Lionel wasn't very worried about the second possibility, mostly because at most it would just expose that there were enemies here, something the Raypaks were already aware of. It was also possible that it could reveal their location, but Lionel was confident that they would have made a move by then. So it's an observation station? Aina concluded the same thing Lionel had. I think so. Then we'll need to find another entrance. But, even if we do, it'll be very difficult to handle. I can reverse engineer a path to a suitable entrance. I've already memorized the layout of that spherical hive hovering in the center of that acid lake. The issue isn't that, it's just, what would we find on the inside? If the inside is another maze, we can work with it. If it isn't, then we'll end up surrounded from all sides without a simple way to retreat. Did you notice, by the way? Aina suddenly asked. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. The anarchic force. It's still strong, but there's something oddly mutated about it, as though it feel more malleable and less aggressive. It's like a beast that's been tranquilized. Lionel's brows shot up. When Aina spoke those words, he too realized it. After a moment of thought, he felt like he had come to a conclusion, but he still reached out to Wise Star Order. Anarchic force is the antithesis of life. It's one thing for the Rapax to force their young to be born in such an environment, but it would be another thing entirely if they just allowed the anarchic force to kill them. The girl is sharper than you. The heavy life force in the air, caused by the fertilizer, has a sort of muting effect on anarchic force. This isn't because anarchic force is being suppressed, but it's rather because the anarchic force would rather target this pure and high-level life force than target weak and unsavory babies. That vat of green is where it all is. The toxicity is concentrated in the top layer because that's where all the life force and anarchic force are fusing. The result of their combat is something high poisonous to life. Lionel nodded. He wasn't shocked Aina noticed before he did. Her life force affinity was off the charts, it was only right. But, this changed a few things about how Lionel could approach this. Firstly, muted anarchic force meant that he could use more mage tactics and that his bow force's range would be much longer. But, most importantly, he just might be able to draw a teleportation force art that could get them out of here so long as the anarchic force continued to be so docile. The formation wouldn't be enough to take them far. But, at the very least, it would be able to get them out of the center of this nest and toward an exit. There was no doubt that once they stole the egg, the Rapax would be livid. By then, their main focus should be on running for their lives. Bang! 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 Lionel's gaze narrowed, the sudden series of sounds making him peek his head around the corner once more. There, on one of the winding paths, a group of youths charged, battling the Rapax that stood in their way. Chapter 1367. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 1367. Wild abandon. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1367. Wild abandon. The moment that group acted, it was as though a chain reaction had been set off. Several roars resounded and several more groups charged out, each claiming a path for themselves and cutting toward the perforated nest. Lionel chuckled. It seemed that his worries about being found out were unfounded. The cascading effect of the movement of one suddenly unleashed a barrage of assaults from all sides. Shall we? Lionel asked. But we haven't found a doorway yet. Lionel grinned. You didn't know? Your boyfriend can fly, I'm basically Superman. Aina hardly got to respond before she found herself squealing. Lionel swept her into his arms and rounded the corner once more. He crouched into a powerful squat, his thighs bulging and calves compressing until they were as hard as steel. In that moment, his aura flourished, a blinding golden light enveloping his body as he was covered in head to toe by tiny white gold scales. Bang! Lionel unfurled himself all at once, slicing through the air like a speeding bullet. Almost instantly, he appeared above the green lake, a singular dot in the skies amidst a commotion. But, even then, he somehow managed to be the center of attention. Steam rolling into battle, a beauty cradled in his arms, and wings spreading to his back. In this bleak world, he was like the only ray of radiant sun, the majestic sight of his very being attracting attention from all sides. Lionel soared, feeling his snowy star owl blood rolling through his veins. He could feel it pressing against its very limits, the breakthrough in comprehension he had made in his scarlet star force stimulating it all to the absolute extreme. Lionel let the feeling roll through him. He didn't move, he simply let the air whip against his skin, his eyes closed and his expression peaceful. His skin began to radiate a delicate golden color that quickly became fiercer and fiercer. In those moments, everything around Lionel was so pure that even the foul stench of the Rapax nest couldn't approach him, the refreshing scent of a dawning day, delicate dewdrops and life wafting around him. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. There didn't need to be a check, nor a guess. Lionel's mind bloomed like a flower, stepping past the barriers of the fifth dimension and sweeping into the sixth. At that moment, Lionel's snowy star owl lineage factor had reached the pinnacle of perfection, unsealing all three branches to the fourth awakening. Boom! Lionel flapped his wings a single time, his already fast speed suddenly doubling, a violent clap of wind shredding the air to his back as he cut through it all even faster. Bang! Lionel swung his feet forward, their soles smashing into the head of a Rapax and crushing their silver skull. He landed heavily on a winding platform, already having covered more than half the distance. The Rapax crumpled beneath his feet, a heavy domain pressing down and shredding it to pieces. Aina jumped from Lionel's arms, her battle axe in tow. A single sweep seemed to sever the world itself, the Rapax in her path finding themselves experiencing just the same fate. Scree-cree. Lionel's mind felt as though it had been injected directly with adrenaline. Everything was so clear, not just through his internal sight, but through his eyes especially. He could see further, even the slightest bits of detail were laid bare before him. In that moment, things that Lionel would usually rely on his internal sight to pick up on suddenly didn't need it at all. And, just like that, the advantage the Rapax had over him vanished in a puff of smoke. Lionel took a step forward, his figure crossing tens of meters in a single bound. When he appeared again, he had seemingly already chosen the perfect position to dodge a coming kick, his makeshift spear stabbing outward and ripping through a gap that felt infinitesimally small in its plate armor. Right then, the Rapax crumbled, but so too did Lionel's makeshift spear, combusting to ash in his palm. Lionel immediately knew why that was. It seems he had gotten the spear domain to acknowledge him enough to hold a spear without destroying it, but he still hadn't gained enough acknowledgement to be able to make it acknowledge one of his creations just yet. However, this wasn't enough to make Lionel slow in the slightest. If he couldn't use a spear, then he would just use his fists. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. NetDream class. Speed fighter. Lionel's steps shifted, his body flickering and his speed reaching nigh untouchable levels. He left afterimages in his wake. Whenever he appeared, another fist would jet outward, blasting a hole through yet another Rapax. His eyes darted back and forth. It felt like there was nothing he couldn't see, nothing he couldn't observe. The twitch of their muscles, the shift in their weight, even the slight change caused by a rush of their blood was all picked up by him. Numbers seemed to float in his vision. Speed, weight, power, distance, it all branched off one after another. It was as though Lionel's dream world had manifested into reality, layering atop what was with an objective measure of what is. It would be a very long time until Lionel realized that this was the first instance of his dream force working as it should, his consciousness projecting into the world and affecting it. This is what it truly meant to have high dream force affinity. A wild grin spread across Lionel's face. Every swing of his fist and every slice of Aina's axe only made him smile all the more wildly. This feeling, it was exhilarating. Lionel shifted around another Rapax, sidestepping the tail of another as his hand reached out, snatching the curved blade with his bare palm and squeezing down. Sitai. The metallic tail crumbled, wild bronze runes racing beneath Lionel's scales. Lionel gave a strong pull, causing the Rapax to suddenly find itself flying in his direction, only to be met by a fist that crushed its head. He stepped over the corpse, his body swaying to one side to dodge a kick. His wings slapped outward, causing the balance of the Rapax to falter and spin. Ha! Lionel took a strong step forward with one leg and sent the other shooting straight up. His heel connected with the chin of the Rapax with such force that its head was ripped from its body. Lionel's roar bellowed through the Rapax nest, his blood flowing with wild abandon. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1368. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 1368, 0. 15 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again 1368, 0. 15 Lionel left a blazing trail in his wake. Sometimes, it would feel as though he was attacking 3 different places at once, his speed so fast that it was almost impossible to keep up with. The first awakening of the speed branch merely allowed Lionel to access light elemental force in a fashion that could boost his fast twitch capabilities, not much unlike an elemental speedster, but on a much smaller and more controlled level. The second awakening gave Lionel access to the Star Road. It was the road of stars that appeared beneath his feet. Stepping onto the road made Lionel feel lighter and also seemed to weaken several forms of friction, making gliding through the air feel all too easy. The third awakening was primed for awakening with the appearance of Lionel's illusory wings and came into true being once Lionel's wings gained physical form, spreading out from his body both powerfully and majestically. The fourth awakening, however, was the most profound of them all. Lionel felt light force fuse with his very bones and flesh, suddenly making him feel as light as a feather. The difference was so drastic that had it not been for the increase to his wisdom branch simultaneously, Lionel might have had to artificially slow himself just so that his mind could keep up. Now, Lionel suddenly had a body as sturdy as any Tier 9 forged weapon, and yet instead of being weighed down, he was as light and free as a breeze of air. Golden runes shaped into delicate feather patterns danced between the bronze runes that were deeply carved onto his bones, making him feel as though he was gliding through the air as opposed to running on ground. In that moment, Lionel could feel the exhilaration of a speedster, a hearty laughter almost leaving his lips. The Morales family lineage factor was always known to be the cream of the crop because it circumvented the usual pitfalls and weaknesses of defensive abilities in ways most others could not. Despite having skin as tough as metal, Lionel hardly lost any flexibility or speed. However, when a lineage factor that was already so amazing to begin with was suddenly stacked with another that not only erased its minor weaknesses, but even turned them into strength. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Well, the results spoke for themselves. Lionel vanished, suddenly appearing above a Rapax that had just swung down a kick at full force. His toes lightly tapped the Rapax's knee, causing a strong surge of golden spear force infused with snow force and destruction to slice downward. The Rapax immediately found its leg severed at the thigh, its weight falling forward as it lost its balance. It had already been leaning forward to begin with after its attack missed, but now it seemed that it wouldn't be able to do anything at all as it fell toward Lionel. Lionel used the light touch of the tap of his foot to skip upward, his body spinning and a vicious kick landing on the side of the Rapax's pill-shaped head. The sound of metal crashing against metal resounded for just a moment before one side crumpled and collapsed. The Rapax's head was ripped from its shoulders, its head being sent spiraling into the green lake below. Lionel landed on the ground for just a moment before he vanished once more, a spiraling circle of wind being left in his wake. Everywhere he passed, arcs of light would follow his swinging kicks and fists. The outline of a beautiful dance was marked, a gorgeous white gold painting the otherwise grotesque atmosphere. 0:15. Lionel could feel the shift in his speed fighter class. The fourth awakening had caused his original 1.00 rating of himself going all out to increase, resetting the entire scale. However, even on this new scale, speed had become a relatively greater strength, causing his weakest class, which had sat at 0.07 just a moment ago, to more than double in efficiency. There are diminishing returns to such speeds. It was no wonder that even with such an enormous speed boost after reaching the fourth awakening that the Snow Star Owl would still only be a six-dimensional beast. More speed equals more power, but that's only if weight remains constant. This lineage factor gives me what feels like even more than a ridiculous tenfold increase in speed, but it does so by lowering my weight and by extension my momentum. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If not for the fact I can rely on my metal synergy lineage factor, I would have to be very careful with how I use this speed as well, or I would end up hurting myself. This made perfect sense. This lineage factor was rooted in the blood of a bird. Birds were known for their hollow and fragile bone structures. This should have been something that Lionel had expected. However, he wasn't disappointed. Right now, this boost was exactly what he needed. He was already confident before that no one would be able to stop him from getting this egg, as he always had confidence in himself. But this only made him more assured. Lionel quickly cleared the Rapax. Because he and Aina had landed in the middle of the platform and had not started at the beginning like everyone else, they were far ahead. But that came with its own problems as well. If they weren't fast enough, they would end up pincered from not one, but two sides. By then, what advantage they had gained wouldn't be worth it. However, Lionel had his own plans for this. Aina raced after Lionel, managing to keep up because of how often Lionel had to stop to battle. Any stragglers he missed were unceremoniously cut apart by her. The moment Lionel reached near the end of the platform, he released a low shout, his feet stamping down hard. A flickering golden rune lit in Lionel's irises, a searing heat dancing above his right hip. Destroy. A raging crimson aura erupted from Lionel. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1369. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 9 seconds p.m. Chapter 1369. Easier, not harder. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1369. Easier, not harder. Lionel's spear force came out marked in crimson. As though his blade had been marred by dripping blood, it left streaks of rouge in the air, drawing hard lines into the pathway just as Aina rushed over. Jump! Lionel called out. Aina complied, leaping into the air. She looked down wondering why it was Lionel had asked such a thing, only to find that the last point her foot had touched had already begun to crumble. Lionel's gaze flashed, his foot stomping down hard. He tugged at his variant earth affinity, hard. He knew well that manipulating Earth in a seventh-dimensional plane like this one was impossible, it was far too hard. Maybe only when he formed his sixth-dimensional metal body would he have a slight chance at affecting this environment to any large degree capable of helping in battle. But, right now, Lionel didn't need a large change, he just needed a small nudge, just enough to get a chain reaction going. And that, he most definitely did. Bang! 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 The pathway crumbled. In one moment, there was just a small section of cracks. In the next, there was an entire network of crumbling rocks, falling down in a rain that pelted the surface of the green lake below. Aina landed lightly to Lionel's side, her expression flickering. Even the most benign Earth in a seventh-dimensional world was probably stronger than even the most refined material of the fifth and even much of the sixth dimension. What Lionel had just done was no small feat. She looked to Lionel's side profile, only to find him breathing quite hard. Are you okay? Lionel turned back, facing the entrance to the perforated entrance. I'm fine, just took a lot more out of me than I thought it would. Lionel took a deep breath, suddenly causing a large surge of force to rush toward him. With a thought, he flipped a palm to reveal a pure force crystal, feeling that it wasn't enough. This was among the batch that the golden-scaled koi fish had helped create. Even now, the little guy was still at work, which was excellent for Lionel because this was without a doubt one of the best ways to replenish oneself. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Aina's lip twitched. You, Lionel grinned. I'm Superman and I'm filthy rich, aren't you very lucky? Aina was speechless for a moment before she rolled her eyes. Wasn't he getting a little bit too cocky? Let's go. There was already another surge of Raypaks coming through, but now the two didn't have to worry about any coming from behind them, at least not for now. Up ahead, there was an entrance to the true center of the Nestlé. That really did take a lot. The cost might not be worth it outside of very specific circumstances. Just now, Lionel had drawn the single rune he had comprehended. However, what he hadn't expected was the heftiness of the backlash resulting from drawing it without Scarlet Star Force. Well, maybe backlash wasn't the appropriate way to describe it, but the cost was definitely great. The rune seemed to dislike being drawn with other forces, even the somewhat compatible radiant force Lionel had ended up having to infuse his spear force with. Lionel could tell that if he had used Scarlet Star Force instead, he would have needed not even a fraction of the force he ended up using. But, because he didn't want to harm his body when they were in the beginning stages of such a dangerous mission, he had chosen this route instead. Luckily, everything worked out. But, he would need to keep this in mind for the future. Drawing the rune was the most effective way to stoke destruction, but the cost wasn't worth it if it wasn't done with Scarlet Star Force to begin with. But, that gave Lionel another scary realization. This meant that what he understood about his Scarlet Star force was just the tip of the iceberg. There was actually room for it to get stronger. Idiot. Don't you have a second innate node perfect for this? Lionel's expression flickered as he fought through the last line of Rapax. You mean? Comprehending a rune is supposed to make things easier, not harder on you, or else what would be the point in comprehending it at all? If things just got worse, then you might as well give up and wait for death. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net, so it's not enough to use my innate node as is? No. One rune is far from enough to use the one inside you, but it is enough to use the smaller one with minimal effort. Do I need to implant it into myself? If that's what you needed to do, I would have already told you to do it. You can't. The moment that innate node enters your body, it'll be triggered into undergoing the same growth as the one you have right now. It was only growing so slowly in that other brat because it wasn't his innate node to begin with. Then how do I use it? This isn't rocket science, brat, just grab a hold of it and take control of it. Lionel's gaze glowed. His second innate node was only in the fourth dimension. However, it was precisely because of this that he could somewhat use it. He had been putting off finding a spiritual medium compatible with his comprehension of Camelot's magic system. In fact, he had concluded that the best medium was his very own body. However, what was more compatible with his own body than his very own innate node? Lionel split several minds to think about this matter as he and Aina burst through the final line, opening themselves up the true center of the nest, becoming the very first ones to step foot inside. What lay before them was another elaborate network of mazes, but this time, extrapolated into 3 dimensions. The obvious choice was to try to race to the center of this spherical maze, but Lionel's gaze sharpened, his dreamscape letting off an arc of lightning. Wise Star Order said that the Green Lake's true purpose is the accumulation of life force. The only reason for the toxicity is its interaction with anarchic force. If not for this, it would practically be a wellspring. That means that the destination isn't the center of this maze. It's the bottom. Lionel's gaze shifted downward. He could use his mind to map out this region and eventually find a path. Or, let's blast right through. Lionel's demeanor shifted, his heart rushing. Excitement bubbled up within him. Chapter 1370. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 7 seconds p.m. Chapter 1370. Baffling if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1370. Baffling, blast through? Aina's expression changed. She looked at Lionel as though he was a madman. She could tell that Lionel meant that he wanted to speed things up and rush through the maze by breaking through the walls. But, if that was so easy, everyone would be doing it. They just witnessed together how hard it was for Lionel to deal with that platform, and that had been a thin walkway to begin with. What kind of effort would it take to blast through reinforced walls? The Rapax obviously hadn't built their nests like mazes for fun, there was a purpose behind it. It made it far easier to defend and gave them an added buff toward enemies. The fact it had taken so much effort to get here in the first place was a testament to that. However, toward Aina's words, Lionel only grinned. Cut them down for me. I need a bit. Aina met Lionel's gaze for a moment before she nodded. She would just have to wait to reprimand him for not explaining another time. This situation was even worse than before with Rapax still streaming in. So, she had to prioritize their safety first. The moment Aina stepped in front of him, Lionel took a breath and settled his mind. This region seemed flooded with nothing more than fifth-dimensional solider Rapax. He hadn't even seen a ruined Rapax yet, which was part of the reason their fight until now was so easy. Thanks to this, he didn't have to worry about Aina's safety at all. He could focus his everything on this. With a flip of his palm, a fingernail-sized gemstone appeared in his hand. It seemed almost inconspicuous, but the moment it touched Lionel's palm, it was as though it had been lit on fire. Even when Lionel squeezed his hand shut, radiant light spilled out through the cracks, causing rays of red gold to splinter off in all directions. But, he remained silent, his mind soothed and calm. The feeling was a bit exhilarating and Lionel even felt a hint of excitement bubbling up, but he forcefully repressed it. For at least the first time, he needed it to be absolutely perfect. That way, he could replicate it through his absolute control and achieve the same result again and again. The Camelot magic system had always required a spiritual medium. This was why they used wands and staffs. Some of Madrid's most powerful spells could only be cast with the help of her wand. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Usually, these spiritual mediums were carved out of what the people of Camelot called spiritual trees. But, in Lionel's understanding, these so-called spiritual trees had just been quasi-fourth-dimensional trees capable of withstanding the amplification of force. Through his study of the natural force art left behind by Merlin, Lionel was able to learn that the best spiritual medium of a mage was actually their own body, and this was where magehood and knighthood intersected. This realization was what led to the birth of Lionel's mage core. Ironically, if one looked into Lionel's ethereal glabella now, his mage core had sprung up and looked a lot like one would expect a spiritual tree to look. In that way, everything seemed to have come back around full circle. The petals of Lionel's mage core each represented a separate element. One for fire, another for space, and more for light, variant earth, and now there was even one for water. As Lionel improved, these petals grew more detailed and his mage core grew, allowing Lionel to pull more and more atmospheric force toward himself. Like this, he became his own spiritual medium, allowing him to cast large-scale spells with great effort on his part as he could rely on force outside of his body. But, if one thought about it, didn't the petals of a mage core sound and feel a lot like an innate node? In fact, the more Lionel thought about it, the more he loved the comparison. In fact, an innate node was just an even more intimate part of Lionel than even his mage core could be. This innate node in his palm right now. It was the very same innate node he had been born with as a child, the very one his mother suffered to birth with him, the very one that called down the phenomena upon his birth. The intimacy he had with it, even after so long had passed, transcended almost anything else he had ever experienced in life. Shoo! A strange vacuum seemed to form around Lionel. In that moment, his eyes snapped open, a wild red-gold light shimmering within his irises even as a similarly colored fog began to waft from his body. Junior Scarlet Mage. Lionel exhaled a breath, the temperature around him skyrocketing more and more with every passing second. And yet, he had never felt better in his entire life. His scales lit on fire, his wings following suit soon after. He was bathed in a red-gold flame, a moan almost escaping his lips as the intoxicating feeling spread throughout his body. And then, he tapped his foot to the ground. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Neat. A rushing line of flames spread out from his, quickly drawing a majestic magic circle that surrounded him in the blink of an eye. Each line of fire seemed to race against one another, quickly completing their patterns one at a time. Aina. Follow me. Aina's axe swung down once more as Lionel stretched a hand out. In quick succession, several fireballs formed and shot past her, the heat making even her tough skin tingle. Boom! 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 Aina's eyes widened as she watched the tunnel collapse. When she looked back, she found a hole where Lionel had been, her heart threatening to beat out of her chest. Aina quickly pursued, the sound of rumbling explosion resounding beneath her. No matter how fast she fell down each hole, she couldn't seem to catch up, causing the astonishment on her face to only grow. She knew that these walls were actually fragile compared to normal seventh-dimensional rock. After all, this nest had to be built by hand, so it couldn't be too difficult. As such, they were the equivalent of dried mud in the third dimension, within the seventh dimension. Still, despite knowing all of this, Aina couldn't help but be baffled. Her axe. It could barely leave a small nick on these mud walls. Suddenly, a rush of light flooded Aina's vision and she realized the booming sounds had come to a halt. When her vision cleared, she found Lionel standing before her and a vast underwater cavern before them. Streams of vibrant green waters snaked all around and several waterfalls pooled in from the sides. Toward the center, a delicate stack of heavily runed eggs the size of a human lay, each booming with a clear heartbeat that rocked the soft bed of soaked soil they sat upon. In the very center, there was one egg that was not only by far the largest, it was the only one half submerged in a pond of green liquid. While the runes of the eggs around it varied from black to bronze, to silver and even gold, its runes was a bright green color, radiating its own light. However, this wasn't the most shocking part of the cavern. There was already a battle raging on, and it seemed to have been going on for a while. A litter of Rapak's corpses lay, and at a single glance, it was easy to tell that each of them had been at the 7th dimension, with only a rare few having been at the 6th. It was a deduction enough to leave one frozen in shock. Still battling several more Rapaks, a singular young man with simple black hair stood with nothing more than a sword in hand. When Lionel laid eyes on the young man, though, his expression went as cold as ice despite the star-like temperatures he was radiating. The Sword Deity. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1371. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:43 and 6 seconds p.m. Chapter 1371. Deliberate steps. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1371. Deliberate steps. Anna frowned. Looking toward Lionel's back, she could feel that something was off. However, she didn't know about what had happened between Lionel and Amory, as she had already left before them. There didn't seem to be anything too drastically different about Lionel's expression, but she could just sense the shift. It wasn't really something she had ever felt from him before, at least not in such an obvious and large quantity. Her gaze turned back to Amory, her brows furrowing deeper. Someone had gotten here before them, and by the looks of it, they had already been here for a long while, even to the point of fighting all of these Rapaks alone. The 7th dimensional Rapaks that had fallen had clearly been severely weakened. However, even with that being the case, their strength was still beyond what normal 6th-dimensional existences could match. And yet, somehow, this singular young man had taken them all on without the slightest hint of help from others. 6th dimension? He's in the 6th dimension? But, Aina had assumed that this young man was part of the true selection, and likely even the one other amethyst token wielder everyone was talking about. But, everyone in their generation should still be within the 5th dimension, no? Void Palace didn't allow anyone who had crossed that barrier in because they only raised students who had taken the God path. Unless this young man managed to step onto the God path without the help of the Void Palace? Aina wasn't sure what such a thing would entail, but her intuition told her that such a feat wasn't normal by any stretch of the imagination, even if you had a powerful family backing you. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. You know him? Aina asked Lionel, treading lightly. Lionel didn't answer immediately. His breathing calmed and his heart returned to its steady beat. Let's just say I have a few things to pay him back for, he said evenly. From start to finish, Amory didn't look back. There was simply no way that someone who was battling such a large number of Rapaks could possibly have such dull senses, so the only explanation was that he had sensed them and he simply didn't care to divert his attention. Without a word, Lionel plopped down and crossed his legs, closing his eyes. Aina, who obviously witnessed this, had an odd change in expression. She could immediately sense that Lionel's consciousness wasn't in the present any longer, as though it had been sucked up elsewhere. He must want her to look over him, but this situation was a bit, unbeknownst to Aina, who was perfectly correct in her statement. Not only had Lionel's consciousness vanished, but it had entered the spear domain world, his piercing eyes gazing over the horizon. When Amory defeated and quite frankly humiliated him what felt like a lifetime ago now, Lionel hadn't actually been angry. Or, more accurately, he hadn't reacted like he might have otherwise. Granted, part of the reason for this was because he was more focused on saving his own life than anything else. Being enraged at that time would have only brought him closer to his death, not further away. Still, even if Lionel hadn't been so close to death's door that day, his rage still wouldn't have shown on his face. He just wasn't that kind of person. He might choose to entertain an outward display of rage when it was related to someone close and dear to him. But, when it came to his own ego, he preferred a much more quiet, brewing storm. This chapter uploaded first at Novelbin. Net Lionel's father had taught him a lot of things in his life. The ones of main importance were respect and persistence. He carried it wherever he went, and one of the rare times he could find his father being serious about anything was when he spoke of them. However, there were many other lessons that Lionel had learned without being explicitly told. His father's casual demeanor, hiding a lurking, slumbering beast within, was one of those things. A large part of the reason Lionel preferred to handle things himself was because he had observed these matters. A betrayal of his friend? He took it with a placid expression. A betrayal of his lover? He simply cut ties and let the relationship rot. A betrayal of his strength? He let it sit and fester, a small, disguised reminder at the back of his head, waiting to be awakened and remembered. Lionel took a step forward. The darkness of the spear domain hadn't changed. A countless, endless chain of mountains, a dark and black sky, even the cracks of thunder and lightning didn't shed much color at all. Lionel walked down a winding path, regions that used to pressure him greatly rolling off his shoulders as though they weren't there at all. It had been a while since Lionel tried to claim a spear. He had stopped at the quasi-silver spear peaks because it simply wasn't smart to go on. Surviving in spear domain required a powerful spear force, but Lionel had always gotten away with far more because he had a powerful mind to offset his weaknesses. However, now, not only did he have a powerful mind that had recently entered the ranks of the sixth dimension, but his spear force had evolved to a level it had never touched before. A strong barrier of separation lay between the quasi-silver ranks. As though wading through air as thick as crass black oil, Lionel was forced to push through, his light steps becoming heavier and even his skin beginning to weigh him down. However, he pushed through. A shroud of golden spear force surrounded him and pierced forward, shredding the curtain that lay ahead and allowing him to step through. The moment he did, the overwhelming pressure collapsed in from all sides. Lionel's bones creaked and sweat fell from his brows, but he continued to walk forward, one deliberate step after another. Chapter 1372. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 4 seconds p.m. Chapter 1372. Spear domain. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1372 Spear domain. The spear graveyard in the black grade region of the spear domain had truly felt as such. However, as Lionel walked forward and crossed from the bronze grade region into the silver grade region, he felt as though he was entering a whole new world. The number of spears littered in the surroundings were just as numerous and, quite frankly, actually seemed to be far larger in number. The bronze grade region had already been twice as large as the black grade region, and despite just stepping foot in the silver grade region, Lionel could feel that the scale was even larger, at least 10 times that of the bronze region. One would think that the more powerful the spears became, the less of them there would be. But the spear domain seemed to throw this logic out of the window, and Lionel felt that maybe, just for this case alone, it made sense. Lionel didn't know anything about the origins of the spear domain ring, but what he did know was that every spear here had been acknowledged by it. The spear domain wouldn't allow unworthy spears to enter its ranks. Just by this logic alone, it would make sense that those with access to higher quality spears would be the largest pool of powerhouses whose tales could be found inscribed here. It made Lionel think, though. What was he missing out on? If his logic was sound, then that would mean that the spears in the black and bronze regions were far more impressive for having made it so far. To take less and make more of what they had, the spearmen and women of those regions had to climb a far taller mountain. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. The thought made Lionel wonder if he was missing out on the best experiences the spear domain had to offer. Ever since he claimed his first spear peak, he had been treating the spears at the bottom of the hills as mere stepping stones. He only observed them for long enough to grasp their essence and bolster his understanding of the domain that ruled over them all. Lionel took another heavy step forward, his chest heaving. In the future, he would definitely have to observe the spear domain for longer and see if there was anything he had skipped over and missed. He would also definitely have to ask Wise Star Order about what he might or might not know about it. But for now, he needed a quasi-gold spear. Lionel didn't just want to beat Amory, he wanted to defeat him with a spear. Whether that was realistic or not, he didn't know. And, for now, he didn't care. Back then Amory had tried to take his spear domain ring away. There was no doubt in Lionel's mind that Amory was well aware of what family he came from and what the origins of it were, but he simply did not care. It was obvious that Amory both didn't fear the Morales family, and actually just might be enemies with them. Such a victory, Lionel didn't just want to claim for himself, but also the Morales family. Of course, this wasn't because Lionel had suddenly become a loyal to the core Morales family member. It was rather because, as far as he was concerned, this family would be his to control in the future. If he didn't put his best foot forward now, when would he? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net Lionel pulled himself up the hill. By now, in the outside world, his body was completely drenched in sweat. A worried Aina watched on, but there was nothing that she could do. She had to protect Lionel from the front. She hadn't forgotten that they were in the middle of a battlefield right this moment. If it wasn't for Amory, they would have already been swarmed. But, it was clear from Lionel's reaction that Amory was most definitely not an ally. The time continued to tick by and eventually an entire half hour had passed. The sweat drenching Lionel's body had only gotten worse. If Aina didn't know better, she would have thought that Lionel was being boiled alive, but what could possibly force someone with maybe the greatest fire elemental affinity in the human domain to sweat like this? Aina could only be baffled. Lionel's force didn't seem to be circulating and his strength seemed stagnate as his stamina plummeted. None of it made sense. Aina's head suddenly snapped up, her gaze narrowing. She had expected this to happen, but when it finally did, she still couldn't help but put her guard up. Several groups of youths poured in, having been delayed by going to the wrong location. When they saw the situation, many didn't quite know or understand how to react. And, the few that recognized Amory, gave themselves a long pause, apprehension growing in their hearts. Conan of the Leo family, Simona of the Pius family and the large Armand of the Terrius family were all present. However, they only represented the geniuses of just their foggy lake. Aina could tell instantly, just from her instinct alone, that there were at least 6 or more others that carried that same level of danger in the way they carried themselves. Lionel and Aina didn't go unnoticed, and it made those that recognized them frown. They could accept Amory getting here before them, but Lionel and Aina were a different matter entirely. Among this number included a familiar group of 3. Or, rather 2. It seemed that the third of their trio hadn't made it. The atmosphere immediately became odd. In the center, there was a singular young man fighting dozens of elite Raypaks on his own. The effort on his part wasn't small, but it was clear that he was reserving himself, waiting for something. Around this battle, several groups formed, among which was Lionel and Aina. Many of them eyed the egg, unwilling to take their eyes off of it. Not everyone understood exactly what was at stake here. In fact, the majority were ignorant. However, it didn't take a genius to understand what the most valuable thing here was. Aina's grip tightened around her axe, her eyes remaining focused as she protected Lionel to her back. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1373. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 3 seconds p.m. Chapter 1373. I'll explain if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1373. I'll explain. The hilt of Aina's battle axe slammed against the ground with a dull thud, a light breath leaving her lips. Her posture straightened and her eyes partially closed. Her aura seemed to steam and bubble, the dangerous air coming off of her multiplying several times every second even as the subtle patterns of a black panther crawled up her skin, highlighted by a faint crimson glow. Her hair was gently lifted into the wind before settling down, its length so long that it almost graced the ground with its presence. Though she didn't move or say a single word, her entire demeanor screamed danger. If anyone took even a single step toward Lionel, she would lash out. The gazes of several of the geniuses narrowed. Everyone had the feeling that this situation was only growing more complicated with each passing moment, and it was difficult for them to tell exactly where their place should be. It was difficult enough for the absolute geniuses who would have been amethyst token wielders in other years to decide how to act, but the stragglers that were golden token wielders at best were even more lost, suddenly feeling that it was a mistake to come so far. At that moment, completely out of everyone's expectations, Lionel's eyes suddenly shot open. A ring of light violently expanded outward, causing a wind to kick up and a wall of pressure to push outward. Some of the weaker individuals found themselves almost lifted up from their feet, their bodies being sent stumbling backward. Lionel exhaled a long breath, his body slowly rising. He reached out with a hand, sweat dancing down the contours of his shredded physique. As his metal body progressed, it only seemed to make every fiber more defined, every peak larger and every valley deeper, only for it all to be tightly compressed into a lean, thrumming engine. A spear seemed to manifest from motes of light in the air at the behest of his fingers. The lights grew more numerous before concentrating into a solid weight that fell with the heft of a mountain into Lionel's grip. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed for a moment, there was nothing more than a blinding rod of light, too bright to see any of its individual features. However, when its coat of light began to flake off, dancing in the air like twinkling stars, what was left was a spear too stunning to even be properly described in words. Its length was about 2.5 meters from tip to tip, its minor details more beautiful and gorgeous than the last. Its shaft took up most of its weight, designed with white hexagonal plates of metal. In between the gaps of these white hexagonal plates, radiant golden lights were hidden within, giving off an air of unmatched purity. The spear's blade was a mixture of lethality and astounding design. It had the shape of a harpoon, one side of its blade edge being as flat and smooth as a sword's edge and the other forming 3 menacing curves that looked like a shark's teeth. The blade was almost 2 feet long alone and was a blinding golden color. Sometimes it would appear to be as solid as a finely worked piece of metal, and at other times it would appear as intangible as light itself, dancing between the two dichotomies with a deft ease. Lionel's grip tightened, his arm flexing as he casually swept his spear to the side in an elegant arc bang. The ground was sliced in two and immediately lifted beneath the wind pressure alone, a slab of rock rising up and crash into an opposing wall. The spear made the seventh-dimensional terrain look like nothing more than Play-Doh, its prowess shining through with a healthy arrogance. Lionel's free palm still held onto his original innate node. Without much of a thought, he slid it into his mouth, allowing it to rest beneath his tongue. The familiar heat coursed through his body, making him feel free and alive. His glance swept over Aina. She seemed primed and ready, but he simply smiled. Taking a step forward, his arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her into his embrace. Aina, caught off guard by the sudden showing of affection, faltered slightly. Something about Lionel's sweat after so long consuming cleansing waters every day was particularly refreshing and almost oppressively masculine. It was the kind of smell that left her eyes a bit hazy without her knowledge. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net, you like when I explain what I want to do, right? Aina looked up and toward Lionel's side profile, her gaze suddenly blinking expectantly. Then I'll tell you. Lionel's grin only widened with every passing second. He swept his gaze over the growing number of groups before his gaze landed on Amory. You see that guy over there, he pointed with his spear. Before we leave this nest today, I'm going to kick his ass. But you see, it's kind of unfair, and I'm not a fan of giving my enemies excuses. So, first, I drained most of my stamina claiming this quasi-gold spear. Lionel's gaze shifted from Amory's back, rolling through the crowd of people once more, his voice being the only sound amidst the battle cries and clashes of the Rapax and Amory. But, I don't think that's enough, honestly. I've also heard that there are a lot of people who think my amethyst token shouldn't be in my hands. Lionel released his grip on Aina, taking slow steps forward. His palm flipped over, an amethyst token appearing within. With a flick of his thumb, the token barreled forth before being firmly stuck in the ceiling above Lionel's head, unmoving. So, I thought that I would deal with that first. At that moment, Lionel's eyes locked onto Armand. The image of the latter's disdain due to his bloodline's reaction was still seared into his memory. Since that moment, he had had every intention of defeating this person using the Luxnix family's lineage factor. I don't really care if you all come together or one by one. Either way, you'll fall beneath my blade first. Chapter 1374. Published at 10th of November 2022 12:43 and 1 p.m. Chapter 1374. Monster and Beast Skin. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1374. Monster and Beast Skin. A stunned sort of silence gripped the young geniuses, their eyes suddenly all focusing on the amethyst token vibrating in the ceiling. They had never thought that such a thing would happen, let alone in this sort of situation. Author's note: big boo-boo on my part. I keep saying Armand is part of the Terrius family, but he's actually part of the Tor family. This is an important distinction you guys will learn about in the future. Sorry for the continuity error. Armand's eyes narrowed, his bare torso rippling with strength. Lionel was only just over 2 meters tall, but he stood at 2.5 meters, making the difference between them more than just a single head. With the 2 enormous axes by his side, one to each palm, he looked to be a giant. Whoosh! In that moment, a figure suddenly flickered and vanished, their speed so blindingly fast that it was almost impossible to track with the naked eye. Their bodies seemed to lengthen into a thin string, their body breaking the laws of physics and reaching warp speeds. Even if one tried to blink during their movement, completing the action wouldn't have been possible. The knife appeared before Lionel's neck almost the instant after the figure moved. The blade shot through the air, its speed whipping by Lionel. When it finally came to a halt, the figure that had wielded it had already passed Lionel, also coming to a stop. The sight of a young man drenched in black and red came into view. His body was lanky to an extreme but filled with a lean sort of explosive power. They weren't too tall, but they weren't too short either. Everything about them seemed to scream power. However, you're slow. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Lionel's words drifted into his ears. The young man's gaze shifted from empty space to his blade, only to realize that there wasn't the slightest hint of blood on it. When he looked back toward Lionel, he found that the latter had moved just half a foot to the right at a completely unknown time to him, just enough to dodge the blade by what would have been nothing more than a hair's breadth. At that moment, a strong stomp shook the earth and caused the connecting rivers and waterfalls of green to ripple outward. Armand took another heavy stomp forward, causing a second quake to ripple outward. By the time he primed himself for a third, he was already in a charge, his tall, lumbering figure building up a deathly sort of momentum. I advise you stay out of my way, Rowan Cancer. This bug to squash is mine and mine alone. Rowan stood in silence. He didn't seem to react to anything, whether it was shame for having launched a sneak attack, nor his miss. It was as though none of it had to do with him. But, he continued to stare at the blade without a single word. To insult the Tor family will be the last thing you ever do. Lionel didn't respond. It seemed that this man took pointing a spear toward him as an insult. But, that was fine by him. Today, he had a few points to prove. On the outskirts of the battlefield, within a group, a young man chuckled. All this fighting when there are 2 beauty amongst beauties here. I really don't know which one to choose. Choices. The gaze of the young flickered back and forth between Aina and Simona, truly unable to decide which one to linger upon more. He had a feeling that this sort of matter would be dragged on for a very long time. And, judging by the situation, everyone was waiting for an opportunity to snag the biggest prize. Once Amory was tired out and had gracefully defeated all of the Raypaks for them, there would be a chance to snag the highest prize amidst all the chaos. As far as he was concerned, fighting now would be nothing more than a stroke of the ego. It would waste his time, his stamina, and ruin whatever timing he had. Chasing beauties, however, that was a very different matter. He, John Verg, could always make time to chase women. His mouth would never run out stamina, whether it was for talking or other things. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net bang. John looked back from getting his fill, only for his pupils to constrict. A very familiar figure slid along the ground, their heavy body grinding to a halt at his feet. Armand's hands trembled, flames licking at his arms that threatened to burn them to ash. John looked up from Armand to lock gazes with Lionel. Even without the latter saying a word, the warning seemed to be clear: watch where you're looking. Even while in the midst of battle, it seemed Lionel was well aware of his surroundings. Maybe far too aware. Armand slowly stood from the ground, his pupils constricting as he looked at the state of his forearms. For now, these injuries were only superficial and at most skin deep, something that wasn't a problem for a warrior on his level. However, there was something about these flames that instilled a deep fear within him. If it wasn't for his own force eventually countering it, he felt that he could have already been burnt to ash. Scarlet Star Force, the words Armand spoke seemed to cause the atmosphere to freeze once more. Even Amory, who had yet to turn back to face even a single one of them, had a slight pause in his movements. The weight of such a force was not small by any stretch of the imagination. In one moment, Lionel had gone from someone they were all certain had relied on his connections and nepotism to gain an amethyst token, to a monster in beast skin. The fiery light danced along Lionel's skin, making him look like a Roman god bathed in ambrosia. A steam wafted from his spear, the temperature around him skyrocketing. "Is that it?" he asked lightly. "If this is all my generation has to offer, don't you think it would just be better if you all follow me instead?" Lionel grinned. Chapter 1375. Published at 10th of November 2022, 12:42 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1375. Shadows on the other side. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1375. Shadows on the other side. Lionel, with an ability to use his Scarlet Star Force, even at just the 4th dimensional level, was like giving wings to a tiger. Facing nothing more than a group of 5th dimensional existences only a tier or two higher than him, it made the prowess of the number one flame in all of existence shine through all the more. Lionel's words seemed to stoke a flame in the youths. "So that's what this is about? I heard that the littlest Nova is late to the party, but I didn't expect you to be this desperate. Do you even understand the dynamics between our families to be asking such a question?" The one who spoke was surprising Conan of the Leo family. Despite his usual personality, he had become frighteningly reserved after seeing Amory present. He might have been the first to act had this situation not been so odd to begin with. The Raypaks were so focused on trying to take down Amory that they hadn't even splintered off a single one of them to try and wipe out what remained of their threats. Conan's words, despite his brutish nature, actually sounded quite smart. And, despite seeing Armand, a man he could at best match evenly in battle, thrown back like a ragdoll, he hadn't reacted to this very much either. You can claim an upper hand for now. True state force isn't something that can be countered easily. But, well, I'll soon be in the 6th dimension, the level where true dividing lines and separations will happen. You're quite confident in your innate node, but do you know why innate nodes are rare amongst humans to begin with? Most people born with them end up dying before reaching their primes because they'll be consumed by them. Innate nodes are the path of the spirituals. They're the only race capable of coexisting with such a burden. But for you, not only will our god paths be able to counter your Scarlet Star Force in the future, but you might very well die in a few decades anyway. So don't you think you're too arrogant? Lionel tilted his head to the side, observing Conan from head to toe. He found it somewhat amusing that the man wearing radiant white gold-plated armor was the one calling him out for being too arrogant. It was even funnier because he could feel something quite similar to his king's might coming off of Conan, making him quite sensitive to just how prideful this young man was. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Calm to experience faster update speed that said, Conan was right about one thing he said. Lionel didn't know the dynamics between the families. For all he knew, asking this of these youths was asking them to betray some ties they had already formed or in the worst of cases, betray their family themselves. However, that wasn't what Lionel had meant. I think you've misunderstood me. When I said to follow me, I meant in my shadow. I've heard a lot of complaining about my token, but now that I'm here, no one seems to want to prove or falsify anything. I'm just disappointed. As for what you have to say about my innate node. Lionel's smile faded. Don't assign limits you to do to yourself to me. Conan's gaze narrowed, his expression turning dangerous. No one dared to speak to him like this, no one. But the oppressive might coming off of Lionel seemed no lesser than that of his own. No. It even felt like it faintly surpassed it. Conan's brow couldn't help but furrow. Was there a lineage factor that could match his family's in such a field? Why had he never heard of it, then? Aina, though, found a very different problem with this situation. Lionel isn't usually like this. Something feels off. She found it hard to describe. It wasn't that Lionel wasn't being himself, but it was rather that he was being too much of himself. He might normally think these things in his mind, but it was rare for him to verbalize them. Everything from how he started this matter to how he ended it felt weird. First he wrapped his arm around her waist, then grandly told everyone his plan, and even after all of that, he didn't seem to actually be taking tangible steps toward that goal. Everything had seemed overly showy and arrogant, even down to showing her off and claiming her grandly. But there was ultimately no substance to it all. Lionel wasn't like that. Sure, he had knocked Armand down with a single blow and asserted his dominance. But the Lionel she knew was less of a talker and much more a doer. He preferred to show his arrogance through actions rather than words. If he could do something quicker by punching, he wouldn't bother wagging his tongue. And, when it came to matters related to her, he was especially sensitive. Aina had definitely noticed John's looks. She hadn't done anything because she felt that this was Lionel's stage. Under normal circumstances, he would have already lashed out. And yet, it was odd. On one hand, Aina thought that Lionel was being far more aggressive than he usually was. But, on another, he wasn't being aggressive enough. To an outsider, it sounded like she was asking for the impossible. However, to Aina, without intimately she understood Lionel, she knew something was off. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net there were only two possibilities. Either this was his Scarlet Star Force already making subtle changes to his personality, or... Lionel's gaze sharpened. I knew it. The actions of Amory were odd enough. However, the actions of the ruined Raypax elites bordered on absolutely ridiculous. If anything, the Raypax felt like a race of incompetent, bumbling buffoons with how they had handled everything up until this point. They had practically allowed a group of children to run rampant in their territory with barely any repercussions at all. This egg represented the pinnacle of their race, the future leading expert of their people and an investment they had poured practically everything into. Would this really be all the showing they had for such an important thing? On the other hand, Amory's lack of a response to everything could be taken as a sign of his arrogance, but his pace was still too leisurely and his demeanor far too casual for what he was trying to accomplish. There was only one explanation for everything. It wasn't just Amory that was waiting for something. The Raypax were waiting for something too. On one side there was the Raypax. On another there was the Void Palace. And now, there was a third party. Boom. 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 An entire segment of the underwater cavern collapsed, causing a wall of green water to rush in. It was then they appeared, sinister devils shrouded in darkness. The moment Lionel laid eyes on them, a deep revulsion from the depths of his soul took hold of him, a revulsion he could immediately tell was rooted in his snowy star owl lineage factor. He thought back to Wise Star Order's words. There were 6 lineage factors in the lights. And there were 6 in the dark. They're the shadows on the other side. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1376. Published at 11th of November 2022, 6:47 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1376. Shadow. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1376. Shadow. Lionel immediately shot backward, landing by Anna's side. He crossed the face of Rowan without even glancing his way, his eyes still locked onto the surging waters and flickering shadows. These newcomers seemed to move slowly, but their speed was exceptionally fast. They almost instantly split into two groups, one converging onto the Rapax and the egg, while the others fanned out, clearly wanting to deal with the youths of the Void Palace. Almost the instant they did, Lionel felt an odd shift in the atmosphere. Several heads turned in his direction, their faces obscured by the shadows to the point even their body shapes were hard to make out. Whether they were male or female, fit or slim, even their heights seemed to wildly fluctuate, making Lionel's calculations reboot every other second. A chilling wind nipped at Lionel's neck, but his gaze only became colder. What was immediately obvious was that these individuals couldn't break the rules of the Rapax either. They were almost definitely either within the fifth dimension or the low sixth-dimensional tiers. Lionel's gaze sharpened. He couldn't afford to use this as an experiment any longer. This wasn't the time to train. It was a time to focus on survival. Aina. Yes. Go all out. Bang. Both of their auras skyrocketed, intertwining in a blazing pillar. One side of blinding white, gold and red. Another side of dense black and crimson. A shadow appeared before them both, only to be met with two blades simultaneously. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Boom. Mature snowy star owl? What an unexpected find. Be a good little boy and tell me where you got your lineage factor. The shadow's dense fog seemed to morph, becoming two glistening bat wings that reflected hues of silver from time to time as though it had trapped the rays of the moon. Lionel's lips upturned, forming a sneer. I'm pretty interested in where yours came from too. The shadow seemed stunned for a moment, its wings slightly trembling as one half blocked Lionel's spear and the other handled Aina's battle axe. Even facing the two of them, its feet dug into the ground, its powerful legs pushing back without losing out in the slightest. However, it soon burst into a fit of laughter that grated on the ears, making Lionel feel as though a fork was scraping against his eardrum. You want to know where mine comes from? I have not met a boy so arrogant and ignorant in my life. Do you believe that even if you did know, that you could do something about it? The wings of the shadow flexed. An uncontrollable strength pulsed down Lionel's arms. He immediately found his balance shifting, his attempts at forcing down and fighting back against the feeling failing. Without suspense, both he and Aina were forced back, their bodies sliding against the ground. Lionel's blood rumbled, immediately allowing his wings to unfurl from his back once more. He realized in that moment that there was no sense in holding back against these people. Scales of white gold erupted across his skin, hiding the dense bronze runes that formed beneath them. In that moment, his speed skyrocketed, the golden blade of his spear shimmering with an added flare as he struck outward over a dozen times in quick succession. Aina's pupils elongated and sharpened, her canines growing and the black fog that came off of herself becoming all the more prominent. The pair shot forward in unison, their blades practically intertwining and leaving wild streaks of shimmering, sharp force in the air. Lionel's figure flickered, his spear crown erupting. Radiant light followed his every movement. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Aina's strides were long, her attacks wild. Each movement carried with it an explosive power. The dichotomy of fast and swift versus powerful and purposeful almost instantly overwhelmed the shadow. Lionel was able to calculate Aina's next move even before she did it, and Aina was able to instinctually react to every action Lionel took. Despite it having been over a year since the two fought with one another, it felt as though they had never missed a single day. Lionel's spear flickered, appearing before the shadow's throat, only to instantly find a wing in its path. However, as though he had expected exactly this much, he had already moved, his figure vanishing and appearing to its back. His spear snaked forward as though its trajectory had never changed, piercing toward the back of the shadow's skull. Aina appeared to its front, her stance firm and her battle axe swinging in an upward arc. The momentum of her string was so fierce that its polearm warped and bent, the crashing sounds of wind pushing against its blade making one feel as though their eardrums might burst. The snarky voice of the shadow had long since faded. It was impossible to tell what sort of state it was in or if it had even bled once since this battle began. However, its lack of a word seemed to speak volumes all to itself. The shadow dodged Lionel's spear by tilting its head to the side, but almost immediately crashed against Aina's axe as a result of its efforts. It stumbled backward in time to find that Lionel had already retracted his spear, his heel slamming into the back of the shadow's knee as it retreated. The shadow's heart skipped a beat. With how ethereal its form was currently, it couldn't understand how Lionel had managed to pinpoint its joint so precisely. But, by the time it had finished this thought, it was already too late. Aina's axe descended from the skies, carrying with it the momentum of the original upward swing and slamming downward with a piercing wind pressure that made the shadow feel as though it was about to be split in half without even feeling the touch of the cool blade's edge. Lionel's gaze sharpened, a dense fire lighting within. He had been careful to not use his Scarlet Star Force to not harm Aina, but now was the perfect time. Flames erupted on the tip of his blade, fusing with his spear force in the blink of an eye. Crack! Lionel's expression flickered when he heard this, but his strike remained true, timing it all perfectly. Their teamwork was simply too seamless. However, at that moment, his eyes widened. Retreat. Chapter 1377. Published at 11th of November 2022 6:47 and 37 seconds AM. Chapter 1377. Tell me if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1377. Tell me Aina didn't need a second warning. Her gaze flickered, her muscles reacting on instinct. Her mind flashed back to the flick of Lionel's father's finger. A single action changed the trajectory of an attack that had her everything behind it with what was seemingly minimal effort. The key wasn't to try to reverse everything at once, but rather to apply pressure in a new, easier direction. Well, maybe this was how Lionel would have broken things down. But to Aina, she only needed to see it once and it was already seamlessly incorporated into her battle style. She didn't need to think, she only needed to react. Her AXS arc shifted only the slightest bit, missing its intended target and swinging down and back. In one smooth motion, all of her forward momentum was suddenly pushed in a new direction, sending her body retreating even faster than it had been coming forward. Aina's pupils constricted as a palm enveloped by shadows and darkness just barely missed her chest. If she was just a moment slower, the result would have been devastating. At that moment, a strong wall of wind slammed against Aina's body. But this wind wasn't from the palm, but was rather from a flap of Lionel's wings that had just reached her. Her backward momentum shot up, causing the palm that had still been pursuing her to fall out of range, coming to a halt. Aina immediately recovered, shifting the momentum of her battle axe once again and crossing it before her chest. Her grasp on impetus and motion seemed to have touched an otherworldly level, seamlessly loosening all of the pressure she felt from sudden changes in movement. Still, her heartbeat couldn't help but slow to a crawl, each individual pump becoming more and more powerful. Right then, that attack had come out of nowhere. She would have been a step late in reacting if not for Lionel, something that was shocking to her. It was clear that this individual had tried to get rid of her first and quickly. While Aina was sure that she would have managed to come out without dying, there was no doubt that she would have been injured, maybe even heavily. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Just like that, Lionel and Aina found themselves separated by a few dozen meters, there now being two shadows in between them instead of one, the second seemingly having appeared from thin air. However, Lionel knew better. They hadn't appeared out of nowhere, they had folded space. It was yet another shadow sovereign, a third one had appeared. They're a shadow sovereign. Be careful, Lionel said, pushing his senses to the absolute maximum. He almost hadn't noticed the change. Luckily, ever since he ran into the Umbra family, Lionel had a habit of not only scanning regions, but also checking for shifts in force concentration, a task he assigned to one of his many split minds. The Umbra family had a strong concealment ability that was difficult to detect. The only method was by checking for the shift in dark elemental force concentration. Just then, Lionel had sensed a random and sharp spike which made him realize that there was something wrong. He chose to retreat first and not get greedy. How do you detect them? Aina asked. Feel for dark elemental force. Lionel responded, using his internal sight this time. Though he wasn't sure if there was a way for shadow sovereigns to hide their tracks, but he would rather not let an enemy know that they had to do so. This way, they'd still have a leg up. With just a short exchange, Aina understood. Her dark elemental affinity was high to begin with, this wouldn't be a problem. She wouldn't need Lionel's sharp senses to sense it. After being told once, that was all she needed. The second shadow slowly retracted their palm. It was impossible to see their face, but Lionel still felt uneasy to the point he felt that it was too optimistic to believe that it currently had a surprised expression. This second shadow was far more of a problem. In the short lull, Lionel quickly scanned the battlefield. He realized that the number of shadows wasn't enough to overwhelm them, but they were extraordinarily powerful. If not for Lionel and Aina working together to defeat the first shadow, it would have taken either one of them far more effort. Their battle prowess fighting together was greater than the sum of their individual strengths, something Aina would most definitely remind Lionel of at a future date. Even while being outnumbered, the momentum of the battlefield had taken a large swing. In fact, many youths from the Void Palace had already fallen, never to rise again. Their numbers had already been cut by a fifth, and it was only getting worse with each passing second. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Netto make matters worse, the flood of water the shadows had allowed and was slowly overwhelming the land. Lionel could already feel the moisture at his feet and maybe soon they'd all be wading in it. Things were fine for now because this water was filled with life force and could actually be greatly beneficial if they saved and stored it away. However, what about when the anarchic force poisoned layer began to flood inward as well? That level of toxicity wasn't anything they could combat alone, even Lionel wasn't sure if he would be alright. Get up. The second shadow spoke to the first, a harsh disdain in their voice. The first shadow was the only one to have come so close to losing their life so quickly. Despite its usual snarkiness, the first shadow didn't say a word as it complied. This kid, I'm aware. Go support the others. All the information he has will soon be mine. We don't have a lot of time before the Raypaks try to close the cage of this trap they think they've sprung on us. Yes. The first shadow flickered and vanished, its wings only needing to flap once to take it across the battlefield and toward its target. The palms of the remaining shadow flipped over, revealing two slender shadowy swords. It turned toward Lionel, its head seeming to tilt. Why don't you tell me where the lineage tablet is? Chapter 1378. Published at 11th of November 2022 6:47 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1378. Counter if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1378 counter. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Of all the things he could have expected to happen, this was the last. He didn't think that just existing would end with such people on his tail. He couldn't help but wonder how it was the Luxniks had remained safe for so long. From what Lionel could tell, these shadows definitely came from an organization far more powerful than what the Luxniks could hope to match. Lionel exhaled a light breath. The obvious conclusion was that this was thanks to Y's star order. The old man had remained silent even up until this point despite the fact Lionel was quite certain he was paying attention to the current situation. It suddenly felt obvious to Lionel that the old man had more reasons for forcing the Luxniks to lay low for 3 generations than he was letting on. However, Lionel had absolutely no intention of selling out a family he planned on taking over personally very soon. And, even if he hadn't had such intentions, exposing them would put his mother, grandmother, and cousin in harm's way. If they wanted such information from him, they would have to try harder than this. Lionel's body relaxed. The toned outline of his scale-covered body seemed to lengthen somewhat, his tense muscles loosening. Almost the moment he did, spiraling flames seemed to erupt around him as though this was simply his most natural state. I've never fought a shadow sovereign before, how about you enlighten me? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it flickered and vanished. This time, however, this wasn't an illusion of speed. Lionel could almost impose the image of Little Blackstar onto this person. Whether it was vanishing in a puff of black smoke, walking through the air, or the heavy domain that almost instantly sunk around Lionel, it was all the same. Blood shot up from Lionel's chest, a line being drawn from the middle of his torso up and out his collarbone. The strike was fierce and swift, leaving him almost no room to maneuver. However, it was also shallow. The shadow seemed taken off guard that Lionel hadn't even tried to dodge, but was even more shocked by the fact that their blade hadn't sliced him in two. Unfortunately, as shocked as it might have been about these two things, the spear running through its chest was without a doubt the highest priority. Bang! A surging tide of scarlet star force tore a path out of the shadow's body. Lionel's gaze narrowed. But, almost in directly opposing fashion, a sneer spread across his face. He had spent every day of the last several years of his life with a shadow sovereign by his side. Not just this, but his mind was connected with one. Seeing this sneer, the shadow, who had just been preparing to attack again even with a spear running through its chest, immediately chose to retreat instead. However, under what was the astonished gazes of many spectators, Lionel rushed forward to match its backward momentum. The shadow darted from the left and right, shooting in the skies and even rushing back down to the ground. But, as though he could read the future, Lionel matched it beat for beat, his spear still running through its chest. As expected, the shadow had gone incorporeal, much like Little Blackstar could. While Lionel's spear had, indeed, run through its chest, it had hit nothing but empty air. However, this was exactly what Lionel had been expecting. Caught off guard and unable to react, the shadow sovereign reacted on instinct, dodging Lionel's strike using its greatest evasive ability, and it was exactly this that had caused it to fall into Lionel's trap. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. While in this state, the shadow sovereign had no ability to attack. If wanted to counter Lionel, it would have to become corporeal, but doing such a thing would be like driving a spear through its own chest. Lionel remembered very clearly that Little Blackstar had once saved his life by bringing him into this incorporeal state. The little guy had been so tired after doing this that he couldn't even bring himself into the incorporeal state for a long while. This told Lionel one thing. There was most definitely a limit to how long the shadow could keep this up. Maybe it was a few minutes, maybe it was a few hours, but there was definitely a limit. And, if Lionel was correct, it was definitely on the lower end, or else it wouldn't be moving so erratically. The first shadow that Lionel and Aina had fought together saw this scene and had no idea how to react. The sight would have almost been comedic if it wasn't so blatantly obvious that they were suddenly towing the line of life and death. Shit! The first shadow immediately turned back, only to find Aina in its path. Get out of my way. Aina didn't say a single word, swinging her axe down. Lionel's gaze continued to flicker and calculate. He could already think of several methods the shadow sovereign could use to get out of this fate. It simply had to go somewhere Lionel could not. But, for every second it didn't take one of these options, the more certain Lionel became of a few things. First, the shadow sovereign was already running out of time. And, second, it seemed this incorporeal state didn't allow absolute freedom. At that moment, the shadow suddenly came to a grinding halt, but Lionel was prepared, stopping just as quickly. However, what he wasn't prepared for was the shadow sovereign to suddenly hack up a mouthful of blood. In one moment, Lionel felt like he was piercing through air, and in the next, the weight of flesh pressing around his blade was all too obvious. This should have been a good thing. He should have just found the limits of the Shadow Sovereign. But Lionel's instincts told him different. The Shadow Sovereign had chosen to do this on purpose. On cue, twin swords crossed around Lionel's neck. It seemed the Shadow Sovereign had chosen to use the same trick as Lionel. Exchanging injury for devastation. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1379. Published at 11th of November 2022 6:48 and 23 seconds AM. Chapter 1379. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1379. Yin Yang. At that moment, hanging on the verge of life and death, a twin pair of swords ready to sever his head from his neck, Lionel was calmer than he had ever been. In fact, he was frighteningly so, to the point one would have thought that he was watching a movie play out before him rather than experiencing this himself. But the difference was that even while watching a movie, an observer would have shown more of an expression than he did. In that instant, his irises flashed with a pair of golden red runes, his hidden bronze runes suddenly becoming lit ablaze as a crimson light raced across them and up his neck. Clang! This time, Lionel was certain. Even without being able to see its face, he knew for a fact that its expression had been warped in shock. The twin pair of swords clanged against Lionel's neck as though they were meeting two sides of a steel wall. All of the force that had once coated them crumbled, being destroyed by an odd force field that filled one with an impending sense of danger. Who said destruction could only be used for offense? Lionel's spear ripped upward, slicing through the Shadow's body. He showed not even the slightest hint of mercy, his gaze remaining cold from start to finish. Just as he finally managed to slice its skull in two, the spear force he had been forcefully holding together shattered into motes of light. But the resulting explosion also took with it the head of the Shadow, causing its skull to also explode. Lionel looked toward this scene and shook his head. He had heard the crack before, but it was truly unfortunate. His spear force was the most powerful when his Scarlet Star force was infused into it, but it couldn't retain its structure. It had only lasted a few minutes before shattering, a time that would have been even shorter had Lionel actually been clashing with it instead of just leaving it in what was ultimately thin air, considering the Shadow had spent most of its time incorporeal. Still, this result was satisfactory. He had managed to overwhelm the Shadow with his mind and take it out with minimal effort. This was definitely a good thing because this Shadow seemed to be a top 3 threat amongst them all. Taking it out now removed a huge burden from his shoulders. My spear force seems to still be lacking. I don't think it's a problem of its level. If it can't handle 4th-dimensional Scarlet Star force now as a 5th-dimensional blade force, then it'll never be able to handle it in the future. It needs to evolve beyond its current means without reaching the 6th dimension. This thought made Lionel wonder if he had progressed his bow force too fast. Was there anything he had missed in that time? Lionel retracted his spear, spinning on his heels and rushing toward Aina. She had been blocking the first Shadow for him all this time, and though she was doing fine, it would be best if they could team up and take out yet another Shadow. From what Lionel could tell, he was the only one to have killed a Shadow at all. If things continued like this, it would become troublesome. Conan, his cousin Gunter and Simona, along with their subordinates, had already formed one resistance group. Armand and John had formed another. Finally, Rosen and a few others formed the last. A balance seemed to have been struck, but it had once again entered a lull that made Lionel uncomfortable, especially after so many gazes locked onto him. The moment the Shadow Sovereign had fallen, piercing auras threatened to rip Lionel to shreds. Boom! Lionel stomped a foot down, hard, his head suddenly snapping backward. What remained of the Shadow Sovereign's shadow had shattered like dry ice falling to the ground. Tendrils of darkness spread out wildly, scratching and clawing at the earth and lapping up the slowly moistening ground. Lionel's expression became a fusion of slight shock and confusion. Was there possibly an ability of the dimensional verse capable of bringing someone back from the dead? Or was it really possible that his attack just now hadn't killed this person? Lionel might have been able to accept something like that if he had just used normal spear force, but he had used his Scarlet Star force as well, and it had even exploded, taking the Shadow's head with it. How was any of this possible? The tendrils of Shadow suddenly shot together, forming a large ball of black that burst in the next instant, revealing a figure Lionel understood even less. It had short legs and arms and seemed to be covered by incorporeal fur. It had a round, sturdy belly, and it stood at over 3 meters tall. Its 2 eyes were surrounded by an abyss of black along with its ears, but much of the rest of it out of its limbs shimmered with a sparking white. A panda? It felt like more than if there was ever an emperor of pandas recognized by all, this would be it. This creature felt almost too majestic, to the point that Lionel almost mistook it for being real for just a moment. He could tell that this was just an illusory, it didn't have a tangible form. In fact, it was a lot like his beast constructs when he used the Luxnix family force arts. The Luxnix force arts and much of their techniques should come from the bronze tablet. Are these things related? Lionel's pupils constricted. The shimmering white fur of the glowed brighter and brighter, the moistness of the ground suddenly vanishing as it was all swallowed. It was clear that the Shadow Sovereign was using this to heal itself. But that wasn't the problem. Lionel had already accounted for this possibility, but the injuries he had left behind should have been far too devastating to even think of doing something like this. Yin-Yang Domain. The oppression of the shadow domain around Lionel suddenly increased by tenfold. Chapter 1380. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 1380. Realization: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1380 Realization. Lionel's expression changed. It wasn't because of the pressure, but rather because he felt as though his control over the light element had practically just vanished. To make matters worse, that extended to his Scarlet Star force as well, leaving him baffled. The majestic panda swung a paw. It was a simple action, with hardly any effort put behind it, and yet it almost instantly felt as though the entire world was falling onto him from above. Shit! Lionel dove out of the way, his wings flapping once when he was already out of the way. Boom! The entire cavern quaked, the location where Lionel had just been standing suddenly gaining a paw print that was easily a meter deep. Lionel's expression flickered. That level of strength was ridiculous. Slicing the earth apart or destroying it was one matter, but compressing so much when it was already so sturdy? That was absolutely ridiculous. Had that attack landed on him, unless he used his destruction to flood his runes again, he didn't think a single bone would survive being shattered. Old man, don't you think you've been quiet enough? I know you know something. Is this shadow just unkillable? Should I run? Lionel had never seen an ability allow someone to survive having their head explode. He had no way of telling how many more times the Shadow Panda could repeat that sort of action. The situation was already precarious and he was pushing it by remaining here instead of finding a way to run. If things fell any further out of their favor, Lionel wouldn't care about what benefits they could get here any longer. He would take Aina and run. It's an Aurora Black Panda. Lionel's figure flickered. He tried to approach the panda but it felt as though the laws of nature itself were stopping him. Every step closer he took to the Shadow Panda, it was like his weight would double, his feet becoming filled with lead and his blood running cold. To make matters worse, his control over force would also be slowly ripped away. What does that mean? The Aurora Black Panda is the third in the shadow line of evolution. It's the equivalent in strength of the starry-tailed fox in our lineage. So it's a lineage factor at the pinnacle of the 7th dimension, yes. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Lionel diverted his attention back to Aina to make sure she was faring alright, and he was pleasantly surprised to see that she was actually winning. The longer she battled, the more of an advantage she seemed to gain. Seeing this, Lionel turned his attention away from her entirely. He couldn't afford to keep diverting his brain power, he really did just need to trust her. But it shouldn't be so strong. Why is it so strong? Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor was also considered to be at that level, if not beyond when the fifth door was taken into account, but he couldn't bring out nearly this much power. Of course, that was because most of its strength should be gate-kept behind the doors he had yet to open. But, still, this Aurora Black Panda lineage factor should be similar. The metal synergy lineage factor had doorways and the Aurora Black Panda lineage factor should have awakenings. This was the trade-off. It's not powerful, you're just weak. If it wasn't for the situation, Lionel would have truly rolled his eyes. Couldn't this old man go a single day without spewing this nonsense? The shadows seemed to still be waiting for something. The trump card of the Rapax had yet to be sprung. And, Lionel didn't believe for a second that Amory didn't have the ability to at least kill a shadow just as quickly as he had, and yet despite paying keen attention all this time, he had yet to see anything of the sort. Lionel realized that he was running out of time to decide whether or not he should run, yet this old man was insistent on playing games. I'm not saying this just to say this, it's the truth. I have limited knowledge about the shadow lineage factors as I didn't spend much time studying them for various reasons. But, I know enough to be considered to have surface information. The Aurora Black Panda's awakening levels are the healing branch, the strength branch and the wisdom branch. Its healing branch works differently from the light lineage factors as it functions similar to life steal. Its strength speaks for itself, you've already seen it. As for the wisdom branch, it also manifests differently. Well, at least differently from your snowy star owl lineage factor. The wisdom branch of this third level manifests a domain, and unfortunately for you, the yin-yang domain is like steroids to a shadow sovereign, and that's especially so to you considering the light element is one of your strongest assets. Just explain, I'm running out of time. The yin-yang domain grants control over the balance of two elements and is especially strong when these two elements are on entirely opposing sides. The rise of one leads to the fall of the other. In addition, as the latter falls, it becomes fuel for the former. This domain is basically sucking away all of your light elemental force and converting it to dark elemental force. This not only makes you weaker, it makes all aspects of the Shadow Sovereign's abilities stronger. Lionel's jaw set. Maybe he really should run, then. He doubted that the Shadow Sovereign would be set on following him, at least for now. Considering he had exposed himself to be a Void Palace disciple and a Morales family heir, they knew they could find him again, so they didn't need to take him away now for the sake of the tablet. Damn it. That's a pretty useful domain and it's 7th dimensional too, so I don't have anything that can easily counter it. Lionel looked at his spear. It had a domain he was looking forward to using, but it was only at the pinnacle of the 6th dimension. It could be possible to counter this Shadow Sovereign with it since he doubted the Shadow Sovereign had perfected the Aurora Black Panda lineage factor it wielded yet. But this chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net the situation was becoming too volatile. Boom. The panda swiped again, its figure vanishing and reappearing to Lionel's back. Its paw descended like a mighty avalanche, the weight of a mountain crashing down toward Lionel's head. Fuck, if only I had a domain like this. You will. What do you expect? The Shadow Tail lineage factor, the equivalent of your Snowy Star lineage factor to them, doesn't have a domain either. Who asked you to spend so much time at the lowest levels because you didn't like the next level? Lionel froze, his steps coming to a grinding halt. What did you just say? What are you doing, brat? Run. The paw descended from above, ready to squash Lionel into minced meat. Did you just say Shadow Tail? Shadow Tail. The Umbra family's lineage factor. The very family that had run away from the Three-Finger Cult. The Shadow Tail lineage factor was the first in line of the Shadow lineage factors. The paw continued to swing down, the wind pressure alone making Lionel's knees creak. And yet, he remained unmoving, as straight as a javelin. His father's rage and sadness flickered through his memories. He had never seen his dad make such an expression, one of such hurt and fury. This was the cult that had killed his grandfather. Lionel saw red. I'll kill you all. Boom. Chapter 1381. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 24 seconds AM. Chapter 1381. Worst mistake if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1381. Worst mistake the father Lionel knew was always smiling, always joking, always pointing fun at something. He was a man who didn't take anything seriously, and yet he was the best father Lionel could have ever asked for. There was no one in this world that Lionel respected more, no one he loved more. His father's happiness was his happiness. His father's sadness was his sadness. His father's fury was his fury. Lionel. Many seemed to witness Lionel being crushed beneath a palm that dwarfed the size of his. But, in the very moment that such a thing appeared to happen, a towering pillar of crimson shot into the skies, shredding apart the hand that had come above it. Tier 6. Everything in the surroundings was shredded apart. A violent surge of scarlet star force shot in from all sides, taking apart the yin-yang domain as though it was never there to begin with. The most violent and destructive force in all of existence made its presence known that day and in that moment, furiously tearing apart everything in its path. The shadow panda was sent flying, a pit of magma and molten earth being left in its original location. With slow and deliberate steps, Lionel walked out of the pit, billowing smoke and harsh heat wafting into the surroundings. The spear in his hand was cracked to the point it seemed it might collapse at any moment. Any shred of clothing he had once had vanished as well. However, at that moment, the halo above his head expanded, scanning down the length of his powerfully chiseled body and rising back up to reveal a glorious armor of bright sky blues and reflective silvers. Space began to rapidly heat and then cool, the rapid changes causing the cracking glass effect of the domain around Lionel to become more and more obvious with each passing second. However, it felt like to the man himself, none of it mattered at all. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Bang. Lionel shot forward, cascading colors of violet, crimson, bronze and gold circling around him without pause or end. When he reappeared, he was already swinging his spear down from the skies, its momentum making whatever power the shadow panda had behind its strike seem like nothing more than child's play. You're the destruct. The shadow sovereign spoke again for the first time in several exchanges, but it was already too late to finish its words. Its body was in shambles. Having been in range of Lionel's 8th star formation, an entire side of its body had collapsed and the paw it had used to swipe down toward Lionel had been shredded to pieces, revealing the true shadow instead. Lionel's crack splintered through what remained of the outer shell like a hot knife through butter, his momentum so fierce that the ground beneath them earned a nice gash all to itself. The shadow just barely managed to dodge out the way, losing just a bit more of his shadow panda construct in the process, but Lionel was absolutely relentless. His spear became like a raging flood dragon, every pierce causing spiraling winds to tear vicious holes through the body of the shadow panda. After 3 there was nothing but a single leg, part of a torso and its head remaining. After 3 more, the head was shredded to pieces and there was nothing more than an oversized leg. In a final volley of 3, the shadow coughed up a violent mouthful of blood, their body being sent reeling backward. With a flicker, the shadow vanished into the shadow world. But, the moment it appeared once more, Lionel had removed a hand from his spear, reaching it out in a clawing motion and causing the surroundings of the shadow to crack like glass, freezing it in space. The expression of the shadow changed below its cloak, but the constriction only seemed to double down. Lionel's dream force flourished, his hands still being held up. In that moment, the raging fires around him concentrated into thin lines, rapidly racing across the air as each formed the singular gear of an increasingly complex force art. The Shadow Sovereign was about to learn what true destruction was. Lingering in the air, right this very moment, was a thick assortment of scarlet star force no one but Lionel could even dream of controlling. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. There were only 2 options. The first was to allow it to dissipate over time, making the region safer for everyone. The second, though, was to use it. To destroy everything. The cry of a bird rose through the skies, the complex lines of force art suddenly fusing into a rising phoenix which rose to its tallest height in one flap and shot down in a beam of laser-like crimson light with another. The expressions of all the shadows warped, but it was already too late to do anything. The attack was too powerful, Lionel's fury was too strong, and even if they somehow managed to cross a distance that was much too far, the result would only be their own inevitable destruction. Boom! Lionel's gaze hid coldly behind the visor of his armor. The billowing wind around him and the harsh spike in temperature didn't seem to harm him in the slightest. For the first time, the Raypaks who had focused their attention elsewhere finally focused on the singular young man standing among smoking shards of ice, falling down around him like twinkling stars reflecting harsh ruby colors. Lionel's figure flickered once more, his speed even more unconscious and untouchable than the past. When he reappeared, the ragged body of the shadow was being gripped by its throat, lifted into the air as the last of its life was slowly being squeezed out, 40% of its body having been charred to black. The flames of the phoenix construct rose again, releasing a cry in the skies and reforming to Lionel's back. Three-finger cult. The atmosphere shifted as soon as Lionel uttered these words, every one of the shadows sending a piercing gaze toward him. Put her down. A baritone voice that made Lionel's heart and lungs tremble within his ribcage called out. However, Lionel continued speaking as though he hadn't heard a thing. Your worst mistake was appearing before me today. Lionel's hand squeezed down, an eruption of scarlet star force following his actions and charring everything in its path to ash. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1382. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 22 seconds AM. Chapter 1382. Crown and Halo. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1382. Crown and Halo. The corpse vanished as Lionel released his grip. His head slowly tilted upward, his irises having turned entirely crimson. It seemed as though they had gained unfathomable depths, impossible to gauge, impossible even to look straight into. With a single flap of his wings, the ground beneath him cracked and trembled. When his figure became slightly more substantial than a blur, he had appeared amidst Aina's battle with the first shadow seamlessly, crossing through the parade of blades and sharp wings as though they weren't a danger in the slightest. His spear descended down from the skies, the cracking of its body seeming to be slowly healing with each passing moment, erupting fiery licks of golden-red flames jetting out from its imperfections. No. The raspy voice for the first shadow called out, but there was no longer a chance. The scarlet star force swirling about Lionel now was firmly within the fifth dimension. To these people here, he was a god and a deity, untouchable and unblemished. Bang! The blades severed the shadow in two, incinerating them to ash before even hitting the ground. At that moment, a third shadow appeared before Lionel, just a step too late. Lionel was almost certain that this was the very same man with the low, baritone voice that had called out for him to stop initially. Unfortunately for him, he had been far too slow. A surging palm aimed directly for Lionel's chest, fast and swift. The air collapsed around it, stacking and fusing. There was no room to move or dodge. The instant Lionel landed on the ground, it had arrived and a clap of the sound barrier shattering matched the timing absolutely perfectly. Boom! The hand doubled in size the instant it collided with Lionel, becoming no different from the shadow panda of before. The difference was that this time, rather than being a shadow sovereign, this individual seemed to have a vibration-type ability. The power behind this blow alone should have been enough to even tear a Tier 1 sixth-dimensional existence to shreds in a single strike. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed, and it landed right on Lionel. Vicious winds kicked up, a violent cyclone of wild gusts and gales wreaking havoc toward everything in its path. Aina, who had now ended up to Lionel's back, braced herself for impact, her eyes widening in shock and worry. She didn't understand why Lionel was suddenly so infuriated, but that didn't mean that she wanted to see him hurt. However, what was supposed to come, never did. Lionel's gaze shifted down to the palm resting on his chest. This time, two flickering golden runes danced within his crimson irises, sometimes apart, sometimes fusing. Their fluidity was something that one could get lost in for hours on end, only to realize that you were still in the middle of a battle. Lionel's free hand reached out and clamped down on the wrist of the male shadow. The coldness of his eyes, hidden behind the visor of his divine armor, almost permeated through, making one feel that their souls had suddenly been thrown into the abyss of hell's coolest waters, freezing to death in what was nothing more than a single instant. Ack! A pained roar left the shadow as it pulled away. But, under the horrified gazes of everyone present, the arm that Lionel still held on to crumbled to ash. If the shadow hadn't forcefully ripped itself away, maybe its entire body would have suffered the same fate. It was then that the flickering and dancing golden runes in Lionel's irises increased from 2 each to 3, making the intensity of the flames around him increase once again. Die. Lionel swung his spear from its downward sloped position, leaving a gorgeous arc of crimson and gold that sliced the shadow in two. There was no suspense, only a final roar of struggle before he suddenly found himself eviscerated. At that moment, the glowing phoenix finally caught up to Lionel once again, spiraling into the air and releasing a sonorous call into the skies. Its beak opened wide, its wings spreading and its chest expanding. With a single bellow, a piercing laser of crimson left its lips, cutting across the battlefield and piercing through 2 more shadows. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net they stood not a single chance, finding themselves burnt to ash even before they could even call out for help. The fiery pits left in the beam's wake were quickly dodged by those that remained. The heat alone became enough to char their skins and dry their throats. The phoenix shrunk in size by a small measure, but Lionel didn't seem to care in the slightest. With another command, the majestic bird's chest expanded once more, another beam of light cutting across the battlefield and this time taking out another 3 shadows. Lionel was absolutely relentless. By the time the first beam had landed, he had already crossed through half the battlefield. By the time the second landed, he had reached his destination. His king's might pressured their minds. His scarlet star force pressured their bodies. And his relentless want for violence and blood shook their hearts. It was an absolute slaughter. Lionel didn't seem to see any Rapax or humans. Every time he laid eyes on a shadow, it didn't matter who they were fighting, how many were fighting them, if they were winning their battles or if they were losing. It was simply one savage execution after the next, and none of it seemed to be enough. Even crossing Amory's face, he didn't spare the latter a single glance. Piercing his spear into the ground, he caused a volcanic eruption to splinter even the moistening earth. The shadow, who was arguably the most powerful of them all, fighting amidst Amory and the Rapax, suddenly found that it had nothing steady to stand upon. Lionel didn't even bother to retract his spear from the ground, his hands coming together like a twin pair of claws, clamping down toward either side of the shadow's head. It roared in protest, but the space around its skull suddenly cracked like ice-blue glass, freezing it in place to the point it couldn't move in the slightest. Lionel drove his knee upward, an enraged roar leaving his throat as he slammed his kneecap into the shadow's head. An explosion of ice, space and fire spiraled out in all directions as a headless corpse fell to the ground. Lionel stood in the middle of the battlefield, no one within a 10-meter radius of him except for a litter of corpses. The crown of a king graced his forehead. The halo of a god graced his presence. Chapter 1383. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 20 a.m. Chapter 1383. Good luck if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1383. Good luck. In the skies above the Rapax nest, far above where their protections lay, a raging battle was ongoing. On one side there were the elites amongst the Rapax, and on the other there were the shadows of the Three-Finger Cult. If anyone saw this level of battle, they would realize that it was this that would decide the fates of all those below and not whatever petty squabbles the youths had gotten into. If Lionel saw it, he would come to understand that this was what was truly going on and why it seemed the Rapax had such lackluster preparation. However, upon realizing this, he would also gain himself another question. Where did Amory fit in all of this? The only explanation, then, was that Amory had a method of leaving this place outside of conventional means. On another hand, though, this also meant that the youths who had chosen to run away instead were suddenly in a precarious position. Leaving was impossible for them. There was danger on the inside, and there was most definitely danger on the outside. A group of youths who had had every intention of rushing away and finding a path back to human domain territory within the void battlefield were stuck. They had made it to the outskirts of the nest, only to find that there was nowhere to go. A few brave souls had tried to cross the barrier, as there didn't seem to be anything stopping them, but the result was devastating. The Raypaks and the Shadows didn't even pay attention to these youths, and they were even thousands of kilometers up into the sky, and yet the reverberations of their battle alone was enough to blast everyone who tried to escape into minced meat. The youth found themselves at a loss, not knowing what to do. Running was suicide. Staying was also suicide. What kind of selection was this supposed to be? Among these youths were, surprisingly, Miguel and Noah. They observed the situation with placid expressions, feeling neither fear nor apprehension. However, even if they had no outward showing of emotion, they still weren't taking this matter lightly. The both of them wanted to find a path to survival, and they also both seemed to realize that just staying here wouldn't do them any good either. Everyone was working under the assumption that the Void Palace wouldn't give them an impossible selection to complete, so there had to be a way. Being completely ignorant to the true inner workings of this matter, it would be difficult for any of them to survive this at all if things continued like this. But, maybe the god of fortune had truly smiled down upon this generation. Not only had this god given this generation more talent than maybe every other before it, but it just so happened to hand them a savior this time as well. Velasco scratched his head, feeling annoyed. He really was this close to being in the embrace of his wife. He already knew that Eleanor wouldn't allow him any intimacy with a clone, that was nothing more than a pipe dream. But, he could have at least gotten himself some cuddles and softness. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Unfortunately, these damned kids were so annoying. In truth, he didn't give a single care if all of these children died. The unfortunate part of it all was that his little nephew was part of them. He quite liked his little nephew and couldn't just leave him like this. If Lionel could hear his father's thoughts, he would be speechless. Where was this care and affection for his own son? Why did it sound like he cared about Noah far more than he did Lionel? By all rights, Lionel was technically in an even more dangerous situation because he wasn't even close to leaving. Lionel would definitely have to give his old man a piece of his mind. It really is you. Velasco continued to scratch his head for a moment before switching over to picking at his ears. It was as though he hadn't heard the voice that had so suddenly appeared to his back at all. And yet, this individual didn't do a single thing either. If one knew who this person was, they would have been shocked to an absolute extreme. This sort of apprehension wasn't the sort of trait one would ever expect them to exhibit. There were many ranks amongst the three-finger cult. However, one of the highest was the title of scholar. No one knew exactly how large or widespread the three-finger cult was, but what a select few did know was that there were only 5 confirmed scholars. Every time they appeared, it would without a doubt be during a very important mission. And, without a doubt, this mission would succeed. I understand. This is just an avatar of yours. It's no wonder you haven't done anything. There shouldn't be much of anything you can do. The scholar seemed to visibly relax when he came to this conclusion before his gaze swept over the location Velasco had been observing. If you would like, I won't stop you from taking away those children. Consider it a favor. Their lives and deaths aren't worth much to me anyway. Velasco finally seemed satisfied with how clean his ear was, pulling out his pinky and blowing on it. A shadow sovereign shouldn't be enough for the three-finger cult to make this move. Oh. You're interested in our goals? You're correct, we do indeed have quite the large assortment of shadow sovereigns. 1614 from my recollection. 1615 truly isn't enough for me to make a move. When it comes to blood sovereigns, though, the scholar didn't say anything more, chuckling lightly. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net, interesting. Velasco yawned. He took a step forward and vanished, appearing before the barrier of youths. When Noah saw him, his brows couldn't help but shoot up. Come on kiddos, I'm here to escort you away. Girls, please keep your panties to yourselves, I'm a married man. As for you lads, I don't swing that way, sorry to disappoint. Velasco waved a hand and the barrier retracted. He turned, beginning to bring everyone along with him. In the skies, the scholar sneered. His face, obscured by shadows, twisted, jagged teeth dripping with blood and flesh barely being hidden beneath the dense black. His palms suddenly waved, his cock almost standing at attention when he thought of the feeling of euphoria he would experience not only killing so many people, but especially Velasco himself, even if it was nothing more than an avatar. However, before he could swing down, he suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder, his entire body freezing over as though it had been dunked into a vat of ice water. At some unknown time, Velasco had appeared in front of him, just barely off the side. He placed a palm on his shoulder, leaning forward until his mouth was barely a half-foot away from the scholar's ear. Just as stupid as always. You three-finger cult members are all the same. I didn't make a move before only because I can't be bothered to deal with small fry, but it seems that you didn't take the new lease on life I gave you seriously. In that instant, the shoulder Velasco touched crumbled along with an entire half of the scholar's body. In the blink of an eye, there was nothing just but half a hip, torso and head. The scholar stood shivering in the skies, Velasco's breath still feeling searing hot on its ear. If you manage to survive this, you should learn to count again, by the way. You only have 1613 now. I would also warn you, my son's temper seems worse than mine and my father's. Even if you sent that variant invalid, things probably won't work out so well for you, especially if he finds out you're targeting his little girlfriend. Good luck, though. Velasco turned and vanished once more, the kids below being none the wiser. Maybe I raised that brat wrong. He was supposed to be the calm and cool-headed one. Forget it, if worse comes to worst, they'll just have to have my beautiful Alienor pop out another one for me. As for Lionel's safety, Velasco truly didn't care. As far as he was concerned, any son of his wouldn't have any trouble with even 10 times the odds stacked against them. Chapter 1384. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 18 seconds AM. Chapter 1384, SKRE. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1384 SKRE. Lionel took deep breaths, but he didn't seem to be very tired. It was as though the billowing steam coming off of him painted the illusion that he was heaving much harder than he actually was. Fear and apprehension colored the faces of those in the surroundings. They were suddenly almost too obviously aware that there was no one here capable of withstanding those flames. The prowess of Scarlet Star Force was obvious for all to see, blatantly within their faces. Even the likes of Conan, who had been certain that it would all be meaningless the moment he stepped onto the god path, couldn't help but hold his breath slightly. In one moment, there had been a raging battle going on, and yet in the next, it had all been ended by a singular young man who entered a fit of rage. It was difficult even to fuse the images of the smiling young man from before with the one before them now. Despite the arrogant words he had spoken previously, the joking tone within them and the smile on his face made it difficult to hate Lionel. However, right now, with his face hidden behind a visor and his body wreathed in flames and shards of sparkling ice, it felt difficult to humanize him. He was a monster, an insurmountable mountain. He was exactly as powerful as he needed to be in a given situation, and if you thought him to be weak, well, maybe you should look in the mirror and see if you were worthy of him putting in any effort. At that moment, the ceiling cracked and splintered, a shimmering amethyst token falling from above. Lionel only reached out a palm and it seemed to fall into it as though he had commanded it to do so. He turned back and grabbed his spear, ripping it out from the ground and ignoring the spurt of molten rock that threatened to cover him from head to toe. His body seemed to still be fuming, almost like it was enraged that there weren't any other enemies left to battle. Just thinking this was absolutely ridiculous, especially since there were still a large contingent of Rapax still remaining. As though to confirm exactly this, when Lionel turned back, he found an enormous ruined Rapax looming over him. Its silvery armor was etched in gold runes, and even with its poor, curved posture, it towered over Lionel by at least 2 meters. Lionel looked up, his body uncaring and unmoved as he stared into what he thought would have to be the Rapax's eyes. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The low, almost growl-like breathing of the Rapax echoed through the cavern, the surging tides of water only barely managing to remain relevant in low hums beneath its baritone. The chest of the gold-ruined Rapax rumbled, its plated carapace expanding and contracting along with its breath. Its mouth opened up to reveal 2 rows of long, transparent teeth, each with its own floating golden runes within. These runes happened to match the exact kind that could be found on the claws of its feet, the precise sign of a 7th-dimensional Rapax. Its long tongue dripped with saliva, sliding out of its mouth. Lionel could see the individual imperfections and roughness along it, almost making the blackish-red tongue look a lot more like a piece of sandpaper than flesh. Hints of saliva dripped downward and toward Lionel. But, before they could even reach within a meter of him, it was all incinerated to ash. If Lionel cared to ask why Star Order about this right this moment, he would understand that this was a Rapax method of showing excitement and eagerness. There was a reason that this was the very first time Lionel was seeing any one of their mouths. The Rapax were warriors, bred for this purpose since their youth. From the moment they were sentient of anything, they had already begun to fight for their lives, and even after reaching adulthood, they continued to do so. Whether male, female, young or old. A Rapax would die on the battlefield, and they lived for that sort of thrill. Lionel was too enraged to see it at first, thinking this to just be another challenge, another head he had to slice off. However, the longer it went on, the more Lionel's gaze seemed to waver. He could feel it. The thoughts of this Rapax. No. Its last thoughts. Lionel hadn't considered something very important. These Rapax were so weak now despite having been 7th-dimensional in their primes because they had poured all of their life force into this egg. But what now? Would they just recover given enough time? Lionel now understood he had been too naive. When Y Star Order said that the Rapax went even further when such a talent was born, even using living Rapax, he never said they would get to live. These Rapax Lionel was seeing now were already on their last legs, just a few hours away from breathing their last. He could feel the wall of emotions coming from this Rapax now. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. Excitement, eagerness. Regret. Regret that it didn't get to watch Lionel grow. Regret that it couldn't wait to fight Lionel when he had reached his full potential. Regret that this would be the last chance he would get to face such a warrior. Lionel's expression flickered, his cold gaze softening and his heart skipping a beat. He looked past the Rapax, his eyes landing on the egg. The emotions were different but they still felt so real, not quite human, but who said that only the human experience mattered? He had been so caught up in the Rapax being the others. He had even taken Y Star Order's word at face value, believing this egg to be not much different from a beast crystal you could absorb. But, that's not an egg. That's a baby. A baby that's carrying the hopes and aspirations of its parents and seniors on its shoulders. Lionel's shoulders relaxed, his gaze locking onto the Rapax again. You want to fight? Scree. Let's fight, then. I'll give you the send-off you want. Boom. The ceiling above suddenly came crashing down. Before Lionel could react, a figure fell from the skies, landing on the gold-ruined Rapax before him and squashing it to meat paste. Lionel stood, frozen. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1385. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 17 seconds AM Chapter 1385, My Queen. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again 1385 My Queen. The figure was enormous, just as big as the previously standing gold-runed Rapax had been, and yet somehow far heavier. Standing at 4 meters tall and with a body covered in hair and beast skin, he looked like a Goliath straight from biblical tales. His waist was as wide as a barrel, his arms as thick as legs and his legs as thick as pythons. He was covered in hair from head to toe, down to his legs and arms, and most definitely his chest and torso. His hair was a wild mane of white and his beard followed suit. But, what was the most shocking was the fact his eyes were nothing but orbs of white. Immediately, everyone understood. Variant invalid. The variant invalid took a breath and it suddenly felt as though all the air in the surroundings had surged toward it. Some of the weaker youths were forced to grab a hold of something before they were inadvertently sent flying toward what was clearly an enemy. The variant invalid exhaled and patted its torso. However, the sound was a lot more like metal crashing against metal than flesh meeting flesh. This air smells like shit. How do you Rapax live here? Have a little sense of pride. Ah, fuck it. The variant invalid took another large sniff and its head finally locked in a particular direction before a wide, white smile plastered itself across its face. At that moment, the variant invalid's white hair and beard looked almost ethereal. If one wanted to depict a perfect representation of Zeus, maybe there would be no one better than it. Excellent. 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 The booming voice of the variant invalid caused the cavern to rumble. My queen. My blood sovereign. I have finally found you. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The uproarious laughter of the variant invalid rocked the cavern, its gaze of wild lust locked onto Aina and refusing to move to another place. In that moment, Aina seemed to be plunged back into a well of memories she wanted nothing more than to forget. That familiar feeling of weakness and helplessness, when her life hung in the balance and yet she could do nothing to take control of it. It all came back. However, this Aina was no longer the Aina of back then. That crippling feeling of fear and apprehension suddenly became nothing more than an unfettered rage. Almost the instant the variant invalid had laid eyes on her, her hair began to billow in the winds, her canines growing another length as even the dark, black tattoos that covered her body gained themselves a tinge of crimson. Her battle axe trembled, a crimson light wafting from it. She and it wanted nothing more than to hack this bastard before them to shreds. At that moment, hearing the words the variant invalid spoke, Lionel's gaze slowly looked up from the gold-runed Rapax. All that had been left of it was its head, its tongue still hanging out as though to freeze its feelings of excitement in its final moments, only for it to be robbed away. You may call me the Steel Beast Master. Come, tell me, my queen. What is your name? Our offspring will be legendary. Boom. The laughing of the variant invalid suddenly came to a grinding halt, its body shooting out like a speeding bullet. One would have thought that it weighed no more than a feather would instead of being heavy enough to crush a Rapax to death given its outgoing speed. And yet, reality was right before them all now. Lionel hadn't moved a single inch, but his Scarlet Star Phoenix most definitely had, sending another barreling beam of Scarlet Star Force right into the chest of the so-called Steel Beast Master. Boom. 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 The Steel Beast Master crashed into the walls, surging out into the tide of green liquids once again. Lionel stared into the distance, his gaze lowering down to the Rapax once more. The green waters around it lapped at its body, beginning to dissolve it already. Soon, the Rapax would become much like its ancestors before it, completing the cycle and becoming the nurturing liquid of future generations. Lionel watched this scene silently, not saying a word and not moving in the slightest. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. The human experience wasn't all he wanted to capture. He had Oryx beneath his wings now, and how easy would it have been for him to dehumanize them? There were countless lived experiences in a place as large as the universe, who was he to decide which ones mattered more than the other? "I'll make sure no one touches your junior." Bang! In that moment, another hole in the wall shattered and a familiar enormous figure landed heavily on the ground. Its chest was charred and the white hairs in the area were entirely singed. In some areas, wounds as deep as bone lay. But, just as quickly as they had appeared, layers of skin and cracked bone fell to be replaced by a healthier, stouter flesh. Lionel's head raised again. In the blink of an eye, the steel beast master had closed the distance, standing over the dissolved corpse of the gold-ruined Rapax and towering over Lionel. "You have." Bang! The variant invalid was sent flying once more. However, this time, before it could crash through the walls, Lionel's figure had flickered and vanished, appearing above its head. Shying. 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 Lionel reinforced his spear force, controlling his phoenix to flood into his spear and fuse it until it glowed a fierce red-gold color that radiated enough heat to burn a person to ash. He swung down, his momentum not falling even the slightest bit. The expression of the steel beast master warped. One of its behemoth-sized legs kicked at the air, causing a strong wind pressure to knock it to the side. However, it was still too slow. PCHU. All the defenses in the world couldn't save its arm. The limb flew and spiraled through the air, a spurt of blood following its trajectory as the steel beast master crashed heavily to the ground. Lionel landed as light as a feather, his soft steps ringing out as his crown and halo continued to glow. Chapter 1386. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 1386. Let LT if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1386. Let LT. Many couldn't believe what they were seeing. A variant invalid was considered to be the pinnacle of their dimension, especially when one was at the quasi-sixth dimension like this one. Scarlet Star Force should have only been enough to place them on even ground, not enough for Lionel to overwhelm one to this extent. However, he made it look like it was easy, as though there wasn't anything special at all about what he was doing. Lionel's mind was simply too focused, too cool, too calculated. Nothing escaped his vision, even the slightest twitch was accounted by him and countered in the most efficient way possible. At the same time, Lionel's spear domain lineage factor seemed to fuse with his dream control ability index. Now that his mind had entered the sixth dimension, the fuel given to his spear was on a completely different level. Every instinct, every possibility, every potential counter was refined to the absolute extreme. Lionel knew quite well that he was running out of fifth-dimensional Scarlet Star Force. Once it was gone, it was gone. He didn't know how the creator of had done it, but it didn't matter right now. All he knew was that this variant invalid would fall beneath his blade. The steel beast master slammed a palm to the ground, shooting up. Its expression was like that of a roaring lion, furious and warped, the lines of his flexing features making him look more alien than anything human. It looked at its stump, the wound having already been cauterized by the residual heat of Lionel's swing. The constant burning made it impossible for its healing factor to kick in, leaving it effectively armless until it could break free from this situation. But, was that ever something that Lionel would allow? Even if he wasn't absolutely furious about the last moments of the gold-ruined Rapax, where did this bastard get off thinking that he could do as he pleased with his woman? Shouting and bloviating about their future children and who wasn't now his queen, not bothering to even look down to notice that there was a furious man right beneath him. Lionel's spear swung out again, taking with it another arm. The variant invalid's expression was filled with shock. It had most definitely dodged. How had it still ended up losing yet another arm? And if Lionel could so precisely see through its movements, why hadn't it just taken its head yet? It was then that it suddenly sunk in for the steel beast master. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. A low chuckle left its mouth, shining through his sharp teeth. It had spent its whole life as the predator, from the time it was an invalid, swallowing its own kin, to the point it evolved beyond that and became a variant invalid, before eventually being recruited by the Three-Finger Cult. In truth, it was only chosen for this mission because it was the only one that could pass through the Rapak's barrier. Once it brought Aina back, it wouldn't even be in line to use her, let alone claiming her as queen. This was meant to be its chance. Another swipe of a spear took out the variant invalid's legs and forced it to its knees. Lionel stepped forward, but he suddenly found that a fuming beauty had appeared to his side. "Let it heal," Aina said slowly. Lionel cast a gaze to the side for a moment and retracted his spear and even his armor. He took a step to the side and found a stone to sit on, removing a beast cloth from the segmented cube to cover a small bit of his decency. A dull bang sounded as Aina lowered her axe hilt to the ground, her hair fluttering wildly. Despite being forced to its knees, the Steel Beast Master was still more than a head taller than Aina. And yet, her aura seemed to stifle it entirely. For a moment, the Steel Beast Master was stunned that this was happening, but a low rumbling chuckle eventually left it. In that moment, its arm stumps imploded as a jet of blood flying outward. But, with it, it took much of Lionel's Scarlet Star force. Before the eyes of everyone, its arms regrew and its legs healed. When it rose up, its furious mane was back and the furious glint in its eyes was undeniable. Aina swung her axe the moment it stood to its full height. However, the Steel Beast Master didn't even move, its torso flexing and its gaze looking down toward Aina without a hint of lost confidence. Clang! Boom! The ground beneath their feet shattered like cobwebs, but the variant invalid didn't move a single inch, its flexed torso meeting Aina's battle axe as though its blade was a blunt butter knife. "The worst mistake you could have made was not killing me when you had the chance. I'll be sure to savor each and every one of your deaths, except for you, of course. You'll be the witness to it all." Aina didn't say a single word, at least not immediately. Her hair fluttered, her feet pressed into the splintered ground, her arms flexed and her thighs bulged. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net die. The Steel Beast Master's expression changed. A sudden overwhelming pressure pressed forward, nosing it off its feet. In the next instant, it found itself speed away once again, its body leaving harsh licks of flame in its wake as the atmosphere whined and groaned. Bang! The ground beneath Aina's feet sunk by another measure as the Steel Beast Master skid along the ground. It quickly flipped to its feet, his expression filled with shock as it looked down. There was a shallow wound across its torso, barely deeper than a paper cut and only about a foot in length. Compared to the rest of its body, it was impossibly small. However, it was just enough to drip with blood. At that moment, a strong suction force pulled at it. Though it quickly cut off the feeling, by the time it looked up, a globule of blood as large as its head had already appeared above Aina's palm. The blood thrummed with vitality, shimmering with blinding lights. Aina's palm drew an arc across the air, causing the globule of blood to spread into the form of a blade. An axe blade. Her battle axe stretched outward, allowing the blood to coat it. The effects of this blood would be far more powerful if she ingested it, however she didn't want anything to do with this variant invalid. She didn't want its apology, she didn't want its remorse, and she most definitely didn't want its strength. She only wanted its death. Aina swung her battle axe as the Steel Beast Master's expression widened. It suddenly realized that it was frozen in place and there was absolutely nothing it could do to survive. It had been humiliated not just once, but twice in this day alone. This was how it would die. The variant invalid's corpse fell into two pieces, bursting into motes of light that flew toward both Lionel and Aina's bodies. However, Aina rejected it entirely, giving it all to the former. "I would advise that you not take another step toward that egg," Lionel said lightly, not even looking in Amory's direction. Chapter 1387. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 1387. At once if audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again 1387. At once Lionel's words seemed to light a fuse under an atmosphere that just barely seemed to be calming. Many more had survived than one would have thought, much due to Lionel's previous actions. However, in that moment, everyone seemed to remember the original reason why they had all suddenly ended up in this place. Amory seemed to not have heard Lionel at all, his expression just the same as always. And, oddly enough, despite him continuing to walk and even close in on the egg, Lionel still hadn't looked in his direction. The youths no longer had much of a choice. There were 2 amethyst tokens handed out this year and it felt that neither was undeserving. The tension alone seemed to prove this. In any other situation, those who knew well of Amory's strength would have called Lionel foolish. In fact, even at this point, the bias toward him was still very much real. The difference was that it was far less vocal than it had been in the past. Amory stepped through the maze of eggs, ignoring them all. By this point, the Raypaks that remained had grown too weak to do much of anything. The sudden appearance of the shadows had taken out a lot of their remaining strength and the reinforcements they had been waiting on still hadn't appeared. It was unlikely at this point that they would ever appear now. The strongest of them was the only one that had still had the strength to move around. However, he had found himself crushed by the variant invalid even before he could go out in his final blaze of glory. Lionel watched silently as the Raypaks gathered up the last of their strength, pushing themselves up from the ground and steadily walking toward Amory. Lionel didn't do anything as Amory brandished his sword, cutting them down one after another. No matter how many Raypaks fell, another would appear in their place. Even in their final moments, as they breathed their last and fell to the ground, they took special attention not to harm the eggs around them. Lionel would almost see through their thoughts entirely. They felt that even if the worst case happened, and their future king was taken away and killed, at least what remained of the younger generation would be able to hold them up. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Amory didn't spare these eggs a glance. However, Lionel could tell that he didn't take any special care to hold himself back from harming them either. If it wasn't for the Raypaks using their bodies, at least a dozen eggs would have already been sliced completely through, their lives becoming forfeit before they could even begin to live it. Lionel suddenly sensed a shadow looming overhead, a pair of hands clasping his cheeks and jaw and lifting his head up. He hadn't even noticed, but sitting on this damned rock, his posture had been as terrible as a Raypak's, slouched and curved, his gaze transfixed to the ground. With his back to everything that was happening, it was his internal sight that aided him in spectating everything. Aina felt her heart sink when she saw Lionel's expression. His eyes were sunken and dark as though he hadn't slept in years, his face was covered in sweat that drenched her palms, and his skin felt as scalding as the surface of the sun. He was tired. And how couldn't he be? Rage could only take you so far. Using a 6-dimensional mind was taxing, wielding and restraining atmospheric Scarlet Star Force was taxing, claiming a quasi-gold spear was taxing. He hadn't even managed to have a break all this time. Ever since he had stepped foot into Void Palace territory, it was a constant battle, a constant war. The reason he hadn't moved to stop Amory yet was because he was using the distance the latter had yet to cover as a small buffer to catch his breath. And yet, Lionel grinned. What? Am I that handsome? You look stunned. Aina was stunned for a moment, not even knowing how to react. She suddenly felt that maybe Lionel and his father weren't so different after all. It's fine, you know. You don't have to save everyone. If you had been a little less stubborn, they all could have taken a lot of burden away from you. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. Aina wasn't wrong. Whether it was the shadows, the Raypaks, and especially the variant invalid, if Lionel had been just a little less hot-tempered, it would have been everyone's burden to deal with. Things had started off with Amory being the only tired one, to suddenly him having had the time to recover while it was now Lionel who was coughing up a lung. Lionel chuckled. It was never about them or saving people. He just wanted to chop off a few heads. He just hadn't accounted for the fact that he would actually want to save a baby Raypaks now. Before, he had already decided to trade off giving up on the egg in exchange for teaching the three-finger cult a lesson. Well, now that he thought about it, that decision was pretty reckless too. The three-finger cult wasn't going anywhere, but a shadow sovereign ability in his hands would be an extraordinary boon to his future. By then, it would only be a matter of time before he slaughtered them. But sometimes, Lionel somewhat liked doing the thing that wasn't the most logical. It made him feel more human. Feeling the warmth of Ana's small hands on his face, he smiled. A beauty being worried about his health was pretty nice. What more could a man ask for? Lionel reached out, grabbing his spear and slowly rising until he towered over Ana. At that moment, Amory had reached the egg, the last Rapax having fallen to his feet. He calmly took out an embroidered box as though there was no one else around him. I expect a reward for gallantly saving the world. Lionel said with a grin, still not looking toward the swordsman. Ana rolled her eyes. If we worked together, dealing with him would be easy. Sure. But I have a few debts to settle first. Amory lightly closed the lid of the box, the egg having vanished. And at that instant, both he and Lionel moved at once. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1388. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 1388. Clear line. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1388. Clear line. Clang. Spear and sword met, an overwhelming strength traveling up Lionel's arms and making his teeth chatter. Lionel found an uncontrollable force sending him back, his feet gliding along the moist ground as waters continued to flood inward. At this point, it felt that it would only be a matter of time before they were forced to use force to glide atop the green water. Lionel's gaze shifted to Amory's blade, his lip curling when he realized it was the very same wooden sword from the day. He hadn't even bothered to take out anything better, nor did he feel like he had to. There was something very special about Amory's sword force. It was powerful and seemed to be even more useful than a blade itself. It almost felt like blasphemy to use anything other than a wooden sword because that was the only thing that could bring out its true strength. Lionel knew that this was just an illusion. Or, rather, he deduced that it was, an instinctual sharpness of his eye and experience coming to the conclusion. He could see through and understand much more of Amory's force now, and he knew well that it wasn't because of his spear force. Lionel's aura surged, a crown appearing upon his forehead as a shimmering golden spear took up its center. Amory seemed to respond in kind, a bright golden sword forming upon his. Clang! 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 The flurry of exchanges was heated, but there was no doubt who had the upper hand. In swiftness, Amory was faster. In power, Amory was stronger. In skill, Amory was more deft and dexterous, his sword responding to every situation with the relaxation of a leaf blowing in the wind. The battle seemed to carry him from stance to stance, nothing seeming to be too difficult for him to respond to. Cuts began to appear along Lionel's body, Amory's blade treating his metallic skin like thin sheets of paper. Only the most minor of shifts and dodges managed to keep Lionel away from fatal blows, but it felt as though a trap was closing the distance around him. I see. Lionel's expression remained cold and indifferent, the smile he had had for Ana not seeming to be present in the slightest. So that's the difference between them. That's what my spear force is lacking. That's also what my bow force is lacking. It seems that there's a shortcut that fixes all of this. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Bang. Lionel's aura flourished. No matter how tired he was, there would always be one thing that remained unblemished and untainted, untouched by the weaknesses of the world. His will. A dense purple fog rose up, the shimmering halo above Lionel's head vibrating as he stretched out his spear, the glow suddenly infusing into it. Why did Lionel feel such reverence for Amory's swords? Why did Amory dare to call himself the sword deity? It was because his sword embodied those very characteristics. Wise Star Order had already told Lionel that at the highest levels, force could curate a personality of its own. And, in that case, wouldn't that mean that the highest levels of comprehended blade forces would also have to reach such a level? To step into a realm that would be worthy of the life grade? Amory had to spend his whole life honing his blade, refining his force, and tempering his skill in order to birth a sword force that had its own dignity and pride, one that not only embodied strength, but also a loftiness that few could match. However, Lionel didn't have as many years as Amory did. Nor did he need to. Lionel's king's might flooded his spear force, causing its bright golden hue to suddenly gain a violet tint. The royal violet gold color it now wafted seemed to elevate it to an all-new level. Bang! The crown upon Lionel's forehead grew a size. The singular golden spear tripled, forming two smaller units to its side, the now semicircular crown glowing with a tinge of purple now as well. I would advise that you hold back. Lionel said coldly, his spear swinging again. Clang! For the first time, Lionel's spear met Amory's blade and neither took a single step back. The viciousness of their clash was somehow completely understated, not even the slightest wind splintering outward for just a moment. And then, the cascade of booming cacophonies rampaged about, their figures becoming blurs as they weaved in and out of their clashes, the cavern slowly filling up with water as it trembled. Boom! Lionel landed heavily on the ground, his breath heavy. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Ned Amory landed lightly a distance away. He rose up his sword in a fencing stance, gazing upon his wooden blade with a curious eye. All right, he said lightly. His sword swished downward. In a single motion, it seemed to have flickered and vanished. When Amory's hand rose up once more, a completely different sword had taken its place, reflecting delicate blue lights as rays shone right through it. Shying. A sword howl rose into the skies. I'll show you a small bit of my power. So that you stop wasting my time. I've already said that your spear is weak and you don't deserve the ring on your finger. I have someone much better for it in mind. I don't fight you because I respect you. I fight you because the things you have would be better served elsewhere. I am called the sword deity, Amory. Be thankful that you'll fall beneath my blade. A rising tempest pierced through the skies. Sword gashes suddenly appeared all around Amory without even his effort. It was as though he was pulling sword force from the surroundings, something that should have been completely impossible. And then, it happened. The sound of a shattering barrier resounded and the howl of level 3 sword force roared through the battlefield. Amory flicked his wrist just a single time, causing a wall of white gold sword force to shoot forward like a raging tsunami. Lionel hurriedly crossed his spear across his chest, but even after bracing himself, he found his feet leaving the ground, his ribcage rattling until it shattered. However, even with the pain racking his body, he couldn't take his eyes off of the nick that had appeared in his spear. It started as a small scratch, but the sword force made it deeper and deeper. And soon, Lionel's eyes widened, his quasi-gold spear splitting in two, a line of sword force gaining a clear path to his chest. Chapter 1389. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 10 seconds AM. Chapter 1389. White Lions. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1389. White Lions PCHU. Lionel flew out, a large mouthful of blood flying from his mouth. But soon, the fountain became so large that no one could be sure whether it came from his lip or his torso. Bang! Lionel crashed heavily against the ground, his mind going somewhat blank for a moment. A blade force capable of slicing apart a weapon a step away from the seventh dimension. Even Lionel's Scarlet Star Force hadn't been able to destroy his current spear. It had weathered his breakthrough into Tier 6 with only some superficial cracks, and that was in the presence of the strongest fire force in all of existence. It was difficult even to wrap his head around what level of refinement a blade force needed to reach to be able to display such power. But even then, Lionel's mind seemed all too blank to even begin to parse apart something so complex. Compared to Amory, Lionel had only just entered the world of dimensions. He hated losing. In fact, that wasn't a strong phrase. He abhorred it to the very depths of his being. Losing wasn't something he ever really experienced before, but it seemed to be happening a lot in this place. He never really needed to put in any effort to win. And, quite frankly, the state of the Milky Way galaxy hadn't done much of anything to change that mindset in him. Those people were weak too. There was nothing that could push him, nothing that could really excite him. It was no wonder he had so arrogantly proclaimed that he would become king of it all. It took his father appearing once again to remind him that there was a taller mountain out there. It was just that easy to get Lionel to change his mind state. A single word from his father and everything seemed to relax. He allowed himself to open up again, but he had also become that same relaxed kid with hardly a weight on his shoulders. No, it wasn't that the weight wasn't there, it was just that he had seemingly transferred it to his father, letting him carry it for a while so that he could relax. But, even with that being the case, he really hated to lose. He really, really, really hated it. It was funny for a person like him to have such a disposition. He had coasted through much of life. He coasted through school. He coasted through football. When he entered the dimensional verse, he didn't do much else other than follow Aina, so he coasted again. Then he got it in his head that he would become a king, but had he really put all the effort into that he could? He had definitely tricked himself into thinking he did. He had even abandoned the only woman he had ever really cared for because he was so convinced that he was trying his hardest and his best. But was he? No. Not really. Everything was just too boring. Maybe the only excitement he got from the goal of becoming a king was all the naysayers he got because of it. Maybe that was why he had pushed Aina away to begin with. It was much more interesting when it was someone he cared about that doubted him. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed, but then she stopped doubting him entirely. And then she became a thorn at his side, constantly reminding him of that very same boredom, again and again. Until his father appeared. Like an angel swooping in from the skies, the old man centered him. His father was always the only one that could put him in his place, the only one that could make him feel inferior. The only one that could remind him that he couldn't always have things the way he wanted to have them. Lionel knew exactly what his problem was. It wasn't a goal, it wasn't a lack of aspiration, it was a lack of discipline, a lack of maturity, a childish lashing out by a brat annoyed his dad wasn't always by his side anymore. And suddenly, it made all the sense in the world that his dad had chosen the methods he had, to leave him in this world without backing, without support. But even that wasn't true. How many people could have something like the spear domain? How many could have the segmented cube? A bathing of golden light felt from the skies, white gold illusory feathers falling onto Lionel's body as he rose. Alright, fine. I guess I can't have everything exactly like I want them. Lionel's palm flipped over, revealing the raging aura of a bow. The roar of twin white lions shook the cavern, an aura the likes of which none here had ever personally experienced before swallowing them whole. Amory, who had already turned away, suddenly looked back, only to find Lionel having already pulled the string of his bow tight. Level 3 bow force flourished, its howl swallowing everything in its path. For today, I'll just defeat you with my bow. As for my spear, if you manage to survive this, that is, you can taste it another time. Amory's expression changed wildly as Lionel's fingers released. Clang! The first arrow had already appeared before him in the blink of an eye. Amory quickly flipped a palm, retrieving his crystalline blue sword and parrying it away. But, his hand ended up shooting off and into the air, his grip on his sword almost faltering entirely. Lionel took another step forward and released another arrow. Clang! Amory's expression turned a fiery shade of furious red, his other palm having flipped over to reveal a second sword, this one a crystalline red. Clang! This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel fired again and Amory was nearly lifted from his feet, his heels digging into the ground. The latter released a low roar, his force flourishing and the whites of his eyes vanishing into an abyss of blackness. But, as though he hadn't seen anything at all, Lionel just fired again. Clang. Amory's blue sword was knocked away again. Clang. Amory's red sword was knocked away once more. Clang. Amory's robes were torn to pieces, revealing a hidden armor within. Clang. Lionel's arrow landed in the same exact spot once more, knocking Amory off his feet and sending him crashing into an opposing wall. A barrage of arrows seemed to fall from the skies. There was no technique, no deviations. It wasn't even a question where Lionel was aiming. The distance was simply too close, and having entered the range of a sniper, there was no getting out of it. Arrogant. It was even more arrogant than using a wooden sword. He could have aimed for Amory's head. He could have aimed for the joints in his armor. He could have aimed for his wrists and severed his ability to ever hold a sword at all. And yet, he did none of that. It was as though each arrow was another punch, another furious hit, another close combat barrage. Clang. Lionel's arrow landed in the same spot for the third time, causing Amory's inner armor to crack into countless pieces and fall into useless shards. PCHU. Another arrow soared, but instead of taking Amory's heart, it took his finger, mangling his hand into the same unrecognizable mess the latter had left Lionel's in all those months ago. Amory fell to a knee. Even with his hand in such a state, he never released the grip on his sword. He only watched in silence as his spatial ring landed in Lionel's hand, the box that had stored the egg now no longer being in his possession. Amory didn't say a word as he rolled his finger over his sword domain heirloom. His figure flickered, vanishing into thin air. Lionel stood tall, his bow still roaring as twin white lions raced around him. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1390. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 1390. Boredom. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1390. Boredom. Lionel's gaze remained impassive, shifting down to the bow in his hand before he shook his head. He didn't really feel any sense of accomplishment. He had wanted to defeat Amory with his spear, but that had ended up with his own being cut in half. Not to mention his spear, even his body had almost suffered such a fate. If not for his spear taking much of the edge off, he would have been in two halves right now. Of course, Lionel had progressed a lot. The first time he had fought Amory, the latter had his ability locked and he had dealt with several rounds of vital star force weighing him down. At the same time, Lionel was not only not weighed down by the star force, it even made him several times stronger. Even under those conditions, he had lost handily. In this situation, though Lionel didn't quite know it, Bowman had a decided advantage in anarchic force-laced environments. It was for that reason that Cornelius was so shocked by Lionel's bow force earlier. Being able to use long-ranged attacks in a place where gathering atmospheric force was almost impossible gave one a huge leg up. In fact, it was only because the Rapak's nest was relatively lighter on anarchic force in the first place that Amory's sword force was able to travel so far. But, even then, it weakened too much before it could slice Lionel in half. None of this even mentioned the fact that Lionel had no ability to use his enlightened bow force so many times in a row without the support of this quasi-life grade bow. Even if he hadn't been teaching Amory a lesson and he went directly for the kill, Lionel believed that he would have still needed at least 5 arrows to claim Amory's life. Under normal conditions, Lionel could shoot 2, and if he realized pushed himself into a comatose state, 3. After his mind broke into the 6th dimension, he could barely shoot 4 now. Unfortunately, since his body had yet to catch up, his breakthrough into the 6th dimension didn't give as large a boost as it might otherwise. Regardless, it would leave him one short of victory. Plus, none of this even mentioned what advantages just shooting with this bow alone gave. It was subtle, but Lionel felt that it had had a suppressive effect on Amory's sword force, likely something related to abilities of the bow he had no right to use just yet. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. All of this made Lionel incredibly unsatisfied with this victory. If he had wanted to win like this, he could have done it ages ago. This true selection would have been a joke if he used his bow from the beginning. Lionel suddenly felt a dull thud thump against his chest. Looking down, he found Aina standing before him, a slightly annoyed look on her face. "Less than 4 years," she suddenly said. "Huh. The metamorphosis happened less than 4 years ago and he's been training since he was a toddler. If he saw your face right now, he'd probably die of rage." Lionel raised an eyebrow before he eventually shook his head and chuckled. He never cared to compare himself to others. When he told Conan to stop placing his limitations onto himself, he had meant it. He didn't care how many more years of experience, backing, and knowledge Amory had than him, he still felt like he should be able to win his own way. "You're also lazy." Lionel blinked, snapping out of his own thoughts to look at Aina again. "Don't look at me like that, I'm right. You can easily lose yourself in your work, giving the illusion that you're hard-working, but you only like to focus on things that are interesting to you, or things that give you the thrill of deduction, like finding out something new. But, how often have you stripped things down to their bare bones and just swung a wooden spear 10,000 times in the same stance for days on end?" This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net Lionel opened his mouth to respond, but suddenly found that he had no answer. Was he really lazy? Now that he thought about it, the only reason he was so fascinated with force crafting, at least in the beginning, was because his dad had challenged him. And now, just like Aina said, he loved it because every craft was like a new challenge, a new puzzle to solve, a new world to jump into. She was right, he had never really gotten to the nuts and bolts of things. Aina sighed seeing Lionel's expression. She remembered that at first, she didn't want Lionel to follow her because she cared about him and thought that his talent might not be great enough to stay by her side, not until she got her revenge, anyway. But, almost instantly, he had flipped that thought of hers on its head. He seemed to improve all the time with hardly any effort at all. It was hard to tell someone like that they should be better and do better, especially when it worked so well. Lionel had an embarrassment of riches, but eventually the wellspring would come to an end. Eventually, a quasi-life grade bow wouldn't be enough. Eventually, he wouldn't be able to travel any further in spear domain. Eventually, he would have to travel to places he couldn't survive in with the segmented cube. And then what? Would he hope another rage-fueled tantrum would push him over the edge and give him the strength he needed? If you want to be a king, you should learn how to deal with boredom. Or else, when that peace you want finally comes, what are you going to do with yourself? Aina looked at Lionel seriously when she spoke these words. It was just a few short and simple sentences, and yet it hit Lionel like a truck. She was right, when all the excitement was gone, what would he do? Chapter 1391. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1391. Really? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1391. Really? Lionel fell into silence, his palm flipping to return the bow to the segmented cube. He didn't quite have an answer, he never really thought about it. Even when he was with Aina, he never really thought about what their future together would look like. He didn't think about marriage, he didn't think about kids or grandkids, he never really imagined them growing old together either. It was odd that he never did. A man like him who was logical to a fault should have been thinking about those things. And, at the very least, he should have talked to Aina about it at some point. But, he never brought it up. Do you want kids? Aina, who had been staring intently at Lionel, was suddenly caught completely off guard by the question. She was baffled in one moment before she went entirely red. What are you talking about all of a sudden? Seeing her reaction, Lionel laughed, all his worries seeming to float away. She could be quite bold sometimes, but she could also be adorably embarrassed just as easily. The ebbs and the flows of this were quite peaceful and relaxing. Maybe there was nothing wrong with some forms of boredom. No, really, Lionel said after he finally stopped laughing. Do you? Aina's eyes darted around. She couldn't believe Lionel had really chosen this kind of situation to ask this question. But, seeing that the answer was important to him, she bit her lip and nodded. How many? Lionel pressed. Aina was exasperated. What was wrong with this man all of a sudden? 10, huh? Lionel leaned in. Even with his hearing, Aina had spoken so softly that he couldn't hear exactly what she was saying. Was this really something to be so embarrassed about? As confusing as he was, this woman was even more confusing. She didn't even blink an eye when they got caught making out in the middle of a Raypack's nest. Now she wanted to be all flustered. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed, at least 10, alright? Aina snapped, her voice practically blowing Lionel's hair back. At least 10? Lionel's brows rose. Does that mean you want more than that? Yes. Aina placed her hands on her hips. Is there a problem? I'm doing most of the work anyway. Lionel blinked. It seemed that this was more important to Aina than he knew, to think that he hadn't even thought to ask before. She even seemed a bit defensive about it, as though she was afraid that Lionel would say no. Even without going down that path, Lionel could tell that saying no would really hurt Aina, maybe even more so than those cruel words he had spoken that day on planet Montex. He could even feel the anxiety within her as she waited for him to respond. Lionel felt that he should have been able to guess this long ago. It was one thing for Aina to get super defensive and anxious over her experience with the puppet master back when her psyche still wasn't completely whole. But, for that to bleed over into her rage for the steel beast master as well long after her mind had been repaired was a different matter entirely. What did both variant invalids have in common? Well, both them wanted to use her as some sort of sow to pump out babies for them. Maybe, the reason Aina was so enraged went beyond them just crossing boundaries any woman would have up, but rather because they were also perverting something she held close to her heart and cherished. Lionel smiled. What are you so worried about? Like you said, you're doing most of the work anyway. How about we start now? Lionel's smile spread into a wild grin. 1 baby, 10 babies, 20. He didn't really care one way or another. Aina sighed a breath of relief before she rolled her eyes. I'm ignoring you. She turned away and began to walk to who knows where. How can you ignore me? If we don't start now, how are we supposed to get to 20? Think of the gestation period. Aina's lips arched in a smile Lionel couldn't see as she continued to walk away. The relief in her eyes almost seemed palpable. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Be serious, we need to find a way out of here. Aina stopped by where the green ruined egg had been, waiting for Lionel to put it down so that they could go. She knew Lionel well enough to know that he no longer had any intention of taking the egg with him. I can think of a few ways, Lionel spoke as he took out the box once again. No need to take it too seriously. Getting out of here probably isn't all that difficult anymore. Just look at all the energy around us. Really? Aina raised an eyebrow. Really? Aina was a bit skeptical, but she didn't think he would joke about something like this. Look at you, doubting me. How could you doubt your future baby daddy? Ew, don't say it like that. I physically cringe. What, baby daddy? That struck a nerve. I'm going to slot that in with things you get wrong like putting cereal in first. You're a terrorist to society, Aina snapped back. This terrorist would like to book a baby-making appointment. Really, if we don't start now, it'll be too late. I suddenly regret telling you this. It's real, though. I hear having babies is harder at higher dimensions. The earlier we start, the better. Maybe for other women, but not for me. I can have a baby whenever I want. Lionel's brows shot up. He was going to ask Aina what she meant by that, but his senses caused him to turn his head instead, only to lock eyes with a young man. The two had apparently completely forgotten that there were others around them. That bow. Lionel didn't need to hear the rest for his gaze to narrow. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1392. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1392, You're Not. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The young man wasn't a person that Lionel had interacted with before. He had an unassuming build, but his gaze was extraordinarily sharp, sharper than any Lionel had ever seen before. Among the youths here, he was one of the very few who didn't have a single scratch on him despite the sheer violence and carnage of the previous battle. There was no doubt that this person was highly skilled, extraordinarily so. From what Lionel could tell, this young man was also a person of very few words. The stronger his king's might and dream force became, not to mention his soul, the better he was at reading people. For this young man to come out and say something, it was definitely something that was very important, at least to him. That bow, the young man repeated, seemingly not perturbed by Lionel's silence. How is it in your possession? Lionel observed this young man for a while longer. The silence didn't seem to make either man very awkward at all. Lionel continued to stare and the young man continued to remain silent, waiting for the response he wanted. My mother gave it to me, Lionel finally said. The shock of Lionel's victory against Amory was still hanging thickly in the air. Many didn't quite know what to do moving forward, their minds stuck in limbo. On one hand, the prize they had all rushed forward for was now already in Lionel's hands, and he had also more than proved his strength. On the other, there wasn't an easy way to leave this place and many still didn't know how to wrap their heads around exactly what had just happened before them. For those who knew Amory, they understood him to be a real deity within their generation. If they wanted a chance to catch up to him, they needed to step into the sixth dimension because it was the only way to bridge the advantage given by the sword domain heirloom. Simply put, Amory gained a head start on his god path, touching upon it much earlier than one should thanks to the insights granted by the sword domain. There was no use in getting jealous over it. After all, to be able to earn that sword domain heirloom in that family of monsters to begin with was a feat all to itself. However, to see that legend in their eyes fall, and so easily at that, they found it difficult to wrap their heads around. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed, but this young man seemed to have shocked them awake. That was right. The bow. That bow was at least of the quasi-life grade. In fact, it felt stronger than even others of that caliber they had seen. The fact that Lionel even had it in his possession was shocking enough, but the fact he could actually wield it, the young man's gaze narrowed when he heard Lionel's answer. That bow shouldn't be in the hands of a Morales family member. In fact, it shouldn't be in the hands of anyone not of our families. But, somehow, it has acknowledged you. This does not make sense. The young man knew how finicky this bow was. Most couldn't even lift it up, let alone pull its bowstring. It was like the bow had made the conscious decision to lower itself to Lionel's level, just so that it could help him. It didn't make any sense at all. In fact, it would cause a major uproar if these matters were known about to the Void Palace. No. It would cause a major uproar when these matters were found out. So, what do you want me to do about this, exactly? Lionel asked. He wanted to understand what this young man's goal was exactly. My name is Nazag Terius. I tell you this so you know I am not a coward, but also for you to understand that I'm also far more reasonable than most. If a member of my alliance were to see you with this bow, their first assumption won't be that you claimed it for yourself, their first assumption would be your father has something to do with it. You aren't the first genius bowman in the Void Palace's history, and you aren't the only one of this generation either. Nazag's aura flourished, the piercing howl of enlightened bow force roaring through the surroundings. Lionel's gaze narrowed, but he didn't say a word, waiting for Nazag to finish. If I find out that your father has tampered with the White Lion bow and suppressed its will just so that you can use it to bully those of your own generation, not only I, but the whole of the Constellation Bow Alliance will declare war on the Morales family. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net, wife. Your hubby has returned. Velasco's voice boomed across the void palace, causing its mountains to quake and the youths to his back to cover their ears. Somewhere deep within the void palace, there was one gorgeous woman who rolled her eyes, but outside of her, there were several others that began to scramble. The arrival of Velasco Morales wasn't something any of them took lightly. You kiddos stay here, I have something to take care of. Velasco flashed a smile and his figure vanished, leaving the youths who were still in a daze from their near-death experience alone. When he appeared once more, he was already on the highest peak, his hands in his pockets and his feet suspended in the air. One would have thought that he was the perfect picture of Lionel if not for the fact that unlike his son, Velasco was enamored with dressing as immaculately as possible. Everything on him was prim, proper and trimmed, down to even his individual hair strands. Rosen, why don't you come out here for a chat? By this point, the head of the unfettered Blade Party had already stepped out. His head tilted up into the skies, his jaw steeled. Velasco, don't do any. Val pointed a finger down and as though commanded by a deity, Rosen's right arm began to crumble to ash, vanishing into the wind piece by piece. Just like that, before the eyes of everyone, a mighty swordsman was crippled. You family should think a bit more before they act this time. Luckily for you, this failure and your arm are enough to calm me for now. Velasco looked away from Rosen whose forehead was pulsing with veins and face was dripping with sweat. I've used too much power with this avatar, it's already about to fade away. Wife, wait for me, I am coming. With a step, he vanished. Chapter 1393. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:47 and 3 seconds AM. Chapter 1393. Don't worry if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The weight of Nazag's words were exceptionally heavy, so heavy, in fact, that those who truly understood what the ramifications of such a thing would be were left frozen in silence. A war between the Morales and Constellation Bao alliance wouldn't just throw the human domain into turmoil, it would be a near-extinction level event. With two powerhouses on that level fighting it out, the idea of protecting the rest of the human race would become nothing more than a joke. Before the dust even settled, maybe half the human domain would be embroiled in this war while the other half would simply be too weak to have participated in the first place. The fact that Nazag could spear these words, though, meant a few things. Firstly, there was no doubt that his standing was high, exceptionally so. Even if it was just a guess on his part based on the importance of the Bao to the alliance, there were certain things that people without a certain amount of power wouldn't dare to say. If Nazag held no power, it would be like a homeless man of ancient America declaring that they would lay siege to ancient Russia. It might be true depending on the context, but what place did a homeless man have to speak of such things? If anyone was going to make the decision, it would be the president or someone of high military rank. And that led to the second thing. This Bao was far more important than Lionel knew. It could be said that his mother had dropped a hot potato in his lap. Truthfully, though, Eleanor hadn't been expecting Lionel to gain acknowledgement of the Bao. She had only heard from her father that her little lion was a bowman, so she snatched the best Bao she could find, expecting Lionel to grow into it eventually. She could have never expected that there wouldn't even be a barrier of entry. Like this, Nazag's assumption was quite cogent from his perspective. Lionel, indeed, wasn't the only genius to have ever existed, and while his Scarlet Star force was impressive, none of that was related to bowmanship. None of these people here had any way of knowing how early on Lionel had grasped Bao force, and they were even more in the dark about the fact Lionel would have grasped enlightened Bao force even faster if he had been aware that there were higher levels to strive for. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. It had to be remembered that Lionel originally refused to ask the dictionary about progressing his spearmanship because he wanted to organically progress and improve. He didn't want his decisions to be jaded or influenced by those that came before him. Ultimately, This method had worked out excellently for Lionel as he finally managed to find a method to fuse his intuition with his analytical ability in combat. But the downside was that he was left in the dark about many things until it was later than one might expect. In the end, Lionel had actually ended up only learning of natural spear force and enlightened bow force after entering the fifth dimension, the latter coming later than the former because it was the catalyst that made Lionel realize there was something beyond. With things laid out like this, it was hard to see exactly how Lionel separated himself from other geniuses. Or, more accurately, exactly how he was supposedly a better fit for the White Lion bow than anyone else that had tried to gain its favor. In Nazag's mind, with the information he had on hand, the most likely series of events was that Lionel's father, known for his extraordinary abilities as a force crafter, tampered with the bow to allow Lionel to use it. To those of Nazag's ilk, this was worse than a slap in the face. If Velasco had done such a thing, he might as well have pulled his pants down and pissed into their mouths. It was that foul of a mark on their history. Now, Lionel had suddenly ended up in the middle of not just one, but two sweeping storms. On one side there was the Constellation Bow Alliance and on the other, there was the Swerd family. In the middle, there was the Morales family and much of its current problems seemed to be Lionel's fault. It was then, amidst all the tension, that Lionel suddenly chuckled. His head turned back and looked toward Aina. It seems I'm being underestimated again. Aina shook her head. Blame yourself, who asked you to try and act cool? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net about that baby making appointment, can you be serious? Lionel laughed, his hand reaching for the box and opening the lid. With a thought, he reached in and pulled out the egg, placing it back down where it had been and giving it a small pat. Just sitting there, the little guy was even taller than him. Lionel believed he even felt a little kick just now, causing his lips to curl into a smile. Stay in this egg for a little while longer, your race is much cuter like this. Lionel suddenly felt a hit to his waist. How could you say that to a baby? Did you want to serve this baby up on a platter a few hours ago? So did you. Lionel cleared his throat. Don't worry, even if our baby is ugly, they'll still love them just the same. Watching the two banter as though there was no one around at all, many weren't very certain of how they should be feeling. Did he just ignore the threat? What was happening here, exactly? You all, Lionel looked up, having had his fill of teasing Aina. They'll be leaving this egg here, but that also isn't licensed to take it. I'm going to begin drawing a teleportation formation out of here now. If you'd like to live, then you should probably forget your greed. Lionel spoke these words and then began to do as he said, his mind already becoming focused enough to forget everything else. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.